Does somebody need to accept something on their screen? I know I got something saying you need to allow yourself to be recorded. Seems like I'm not seeing a whole lot of people coming in. Oh, there we go. Okay.
I got that too.
Okay, well,
So
I'm not seeing.
Holding pretty steady at 14, so I imagine we'll be seeing a spike before the second item, but we can probably go ahead and get started.
Thank you. I am hereby calling this meeting to order. Please be courteous and turn off cell phones, pagers, landline ringtones, and other audible devices that could distract from the meeting. Staff, could you please do a roll call?
Yes. Commissioner Carr?
Here.
Commissioner Ocaña?
Here.
Commissioner Diaz?
Here.
Commissioner Davis?
Here.
And Chair Tamura?
Here. And could we get a flag on a screen for the Pledge of Allegiance, please? Great. Commissioner Carr, would you like to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Sure.
Okay.
I pledge allegiance. Hello.
So, Commissioner Carr, we've been muting everybody else during that, so we don't all talk over each other.
Okay.
So it should just be you on the speaker.
Okay. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay, and we have no minutes to approve. Staff, do we have any correspondence or Board of Supervisor actions to be aware of?
No Board of Supervisor actions to be aware of, and all comment for the items today has been sent to the commissioners and made available in the agenda for this item.
Okay, thank you. If any commissioners have a scheduled conflict which may prevent them from sitting the entire hearing, can you please identify that now? Commissioner Ocaña?
I have a scheduling conflict at 6 p.m. So hopefully we'll be able to wrap up before then.
I would also like to wrap up before 6 p.m. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. So public appearances, prior to our first agenda item and up till 1:25 p.m., people can speak on a matter that's not scheduled in today's agenda on matters that are pertinent to the commission's jurisdiction. So for example, opinions about national politics and so forth are not pertinent to our jurisdiction. In addition, we remind people to please be respectful of others. Members of the public who have joined using the Zoom application should identify their desire to speak by either using the raise hand feature or by pressing Alt-Y on the keyboard. And members of the public who have joined by dialing in can raise their hand by pressing *9. And then to lower hands, do the same thing over again. Each commenter will have no more than 3 minutes. Again, this is for issues not on the agenda for today. And I don't see anybody who wants to comment on miscellaneous things not on the agenda for today. The hearing waiver calendar, we do have one item on the hearing waiver calendar. It's for a 6-foot fence at 1416 John Drive in Santa Rosa. That's at the end of the agenda for today. No uncontested calendar. So it is 1:05, so we can proceed on to the first item. This is item number ORD 21-0002. This is for amendments to the zoning code for the ADU ordinances.
Chair Tamura, I did see Commissioner Davis with her hand up.
Oh, sorry, Commissioner Davis, go ahead.
Yeah, just before we get into the
agenda. I didn't hear an opportunity for commissioner comments and announcements. And so I would like to just let the rest of the commission and the public know that I've been working with Supervisor Hopkins, and I made this announcement last week or the week before that I am resigning from the commission. I've had a little over 12 years on here. It's been an amazing service. I am honored to have been able to serve. It's been a wonderful opportunity. And so today is actually my last meeting. And so I just wanted to express my appreciation to everyone on the commission, staff, and the public for, this amazing opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Davis, and I certainly appreciate you being here too. So let's see. Sorry, are there any other commissioner comments? Sorry, I was looking down at the other things. Okay. So on to the first agenda item, which I mentioned was ORD 21-0002. I guess I should ask also for any commissioner disclosures with regard to this item. Please raise your hand if you have any. Okay, seeing none. This is, we'll have a staff.
I'm sorry, can I just, I think there is a disclosure I want to make just because, yeah, it's relevant. I live in an area with a Z overlay. And so I've had some past discussions with staff about the Z overlay in my neighborhood. And I know this ordinance has no bearing at all on my situation, but I have had some conversations about Z overlays in this area. So I just wanted to put that out there because I may reference that at some point. And again, it has no basis at all for this particular item today.
Okay,
Thank
you, Commissioner Davis. Appreciate the disclosure. Anybody else? Okay, I guess I'd like to turn it over to staff for the presentation.
All right, good afternoon all. Everybody seeing my screen and hearing me well?
Yes.
Great. All right, good afternoon, Chair Tamara, Commissioners. I'm Katrina Bramer, and my fellow planner, Nina Bellucci, and I are the project managers for the Accessory Dwelling Unit Ordinance Update. Along with presentation of the highlights of the proposed ordinance, I'll provide some background on accessory dwelling units, also called ADUs, the reason this project is before you today, and how ADUs fit into Permit Sonoma's long-range initiatives. Historically known as granny flats, second units, or mother-in-law units, ADUs are dwelling units allowed in conjunction with a primary single-family residence or multifamily residential building. These units can be created in myriad ways, either through new construction or conversion of existing space in a primary residence or accessory structure. They may be attached to the primary unit or an accessory structure or standalone. Junior accessory dwelling units, or JDUs, are created from space in a single-family residence, have an efficiency kitchen, and may or may not share a bathroom with the primary dwelling. ADUs are typically limited in size to 1,200 square feet, and JDUs are limited to 500 square feet. Because of their size, ADUs and JDUs are generally recognized as being affordable to lower income households. So in the last few years, the state has continued to pass legislation encouraging the production of ADUs and limiting local discretion in regulating ADU development. In response to state law, the first significant changes to the county's regulations came forward in 2017, which increased the maximum unit size and established ministerial approval of ADUs with a 120-day review period. Then in 2018, the Board of Supervisors approved an increase in the maximum unit size to 1,200 square feet and decreased the minimum parcel size for ADUs in urban areas. In 2019, the board approved removal of the Z combining district or ADU exclusion zone from about 2,000 agricultural parcels across the county. And then most recently, jurisdictions across California have had to adapt their review and processing of ADUs and JDUs, once again, based on a number of state laws that went into effect at the beginning of last year. Local ordinances that conflicted with the law became null and void until compliant ordinances are adopted, which was the case for the county's regulations. And so because our ordinance is currently invalid, ADUs have been reviewed and permitted ministerially using only the standards outlined by the state law since January of 2020. The ADU ordinance update is part of Permit Sonoma's efforts to update the county zoning code. In February of this year, the Board of Supervisors approved Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the zoning code modernization program, which included changes intended to make the code easier to read and use, and also to comply with state and federal law. Phase 3 is intended to simplify application processes and reduce processing timelines. In the middle of 2020, the county applied and received a local early action planning grant from the California Department of Housing and Community Development. And the grant will fund a number of projects under the zoning code modernization program, aiming to streamline local planning processes to accelerate housing production. The ordinance update is one of those grant-funded initiatives, and the Board of Supervisors is scheduled in September to discuss and define the scope of the other grant-funded projects. On that date, the board will also consider the Planning Commission's recommendation on the proposed ADU and JDU ordinance and potentially adopt the changes. The goals of the ordinance update were thus twofold: to align local regulations with state law and to facilitate a clear permitting process by making ADU regulations more understandable. Substantive policy changes to ADU requirements beyond what are mandated by state law are not included in the proposed ordinance. The changes relate to permit requirements and where ADUs are allowed to be constructed, the development and design standards applied to ADUs, and minor reformatting for clarity and the addition of new sections that codify existing requirements. Jumping into those changes, state law now mandates a 60-day review period after submission of a complete application to construct an ADU. The law previously required a 120-day review period. To comply with that reduced application review timeframe, Permit Sonoma no longer requires a zoning permit for ADUs as of January last year when the law took effect. And all ADUs have been reviewed ministerially through the building permit process, thereby removing redundancy in permitting and maintaining the same scope of review. The proposed ordinance would memorialize that current permitting practice and specify that ADUs and JDUs are subject to ministerial approval only, which may involve construction-related permits. ADUs must also be allowed to accessory to multifamily residential structures now, whereas they were previously unpermitted by county ordinance. The proposed ordinance would provide for the minimum state requirements and allow either 2 detached ADUs on a lot with an existing multifamily development, or the conversion of existing non-livable space in a multifamily structure may create ADUs up to 25% of the existing number of units on site, but at least one. One ADU could also be created simultaneously with the proposed multifamily structure, but the lot would not be permitted additional ADUs in the future. Arguably, one of the most significant changes to the county's ADU regulations is the state's prohibition on minimum lot size requirements. The county's existing ordinance allowed ADU development with tiered floor area standards based on the type of water and sanitation available and the lot size. Parcels that did not meet the minimum lot size for the available utility service were subject to a discretionary use permit process. The proposed ordinance removes the minimum lot size requirements and allows for ministerial approval of all ADUs meeting standards. The maximum unit size will remain at 1,200 square feet for new construction. However, the law requires that conversions of existing legally established space be exempt from development standards, which includes unit size. So conversions will be limited to a 150 square foot expansion for the purposes of accommodating ingress and egress only. And larger additions may be allowed if they do not result in an ADU greater than 1,200 square feet. Side and rear yard setbacks for ADUs have been reduced to 4 feet, but conversions of legally established space do not have to comply with setbacks. And the front yard setback of the base zoning district of any lot will still apply to new construction ADUs. Local agencies are now prohibited from applying any development standard that would preclude construction of an ADU no greater than 800 square foot in size, 16 feet in height with 4 foot side and rear yard setbacks. And this type of ADU has been coined the statewide exemption ADU. Previously, the size of ADUs would be limited by lot coverage or other requirements. The only change to parking standards is that replacement parking cannot be required for ADUs created through the conversion of a carport or garage. However, JDUs created from a garage will still require replacement parking. And lastly, for JDUs, the primary changes in the proposed ordinance are that they are now allowed to be constructed within the existing or proposed space of a single family residence, rather than being limited to creation from an existing bedroom. And also removal of the requirement for internal access between the JDU and the primary residence. The state law does allow application of objective design standards to ADUs. However, much of the county's existing design requirements are discretionary and subjective in nature. So the proposed ordinance would therefore require that ADUs meet all objective standards, design standards that may apply to the lot, and to meet the state's requirements for objectivity and to inform property owners of which standards might apply to ADUs. Permit Sonoma will publish on its website a list of applicable objective design criteria from the current Sonoma County Code. Then the website will be updated as needed to reflect code changes. Since the publication of the draft ordinance last week, staff has identified the need for a few edits to the ordinance. The commission was forwarded a memo earlier today outlining the changes, and I'll briefly go over them now. They're also available on our website for the public to look at. The first is that language was added to the ordinance to amend a section of the residential use standards in the zoning code to replace the definitions of ADUs and JDUs with the state's definitions, and also to remove the language stating that ADUs are prohibited on properties subject to a Williamson Act contract. The uses on Williamson Act contracted land should be defined by the county's uniform rules for agricultural preserves rather than the zoning code. So eliminating this text from the zoning code does not change the uses that are considered compatible on agricultural contracted land under the uniform rules. And accessory dwelling units are not listed as a compatible use in the rules currently, although multiple types of dwellings are considered compatible or allowed uses in addition to the primary dwelling, including farm family dwellings, ag employee dwellings, and farm worker housing. The second change to the ordinance was a minor modification to the language in the proposed section 2688060 to better illuminate staff's intent to allow detached ADUs on multifamily lots to be located above an accessory structure, as is allowed for ADUs for single family dwellings. So with that, staff recommends that the Planning Commission approve a resolution finding that the proposed ordinance is statutorily exempt from CEQA under Public Resources Code 21080.17 and recommend that the Sonoma County Board of Supervisors adopt the ordinance repealing and replacing sections 2688060 and 2688061 and amending sections 264.020, 2624020, and 2624190 of the Sonoma County Zoning Code. Thank you.
Thank you. Do commissioners have any questions for staff?
I have a couple questions.
Go ahead, Commissioner Carr.
Do you have offhand, Katrina, the number of ADUs and JDUs that we've approved to date?
To date, no, but I think Nina might have it.
Nina?
That's what I'm here for. So in 2021, so year to date, we've issued or started 285 permits. We finalized 108 permits. And that is, we're on pace to almost double the numbers for 2020. Those were, we issued or started 143 and we finalized 137.
So we're somewhere, it sounds like we're somewhere around 500 to 600.
Yeah, I don't know what effect the COVID had on that, or I don't know what the reason exactly is, because we're following the same procedure that we followed last year.
Do you have any sense of generally where in the county that these have been? I mean, rural versus urban, north, south, east, west, that kind of a thing?
We don't have that, no.
Okay.
My sense is it's pretty well distributed.
Okay.
There might have been a spike after the agricultural Z removal project a couple of years ago, and ag land, but I don't actually know.
Oh, that's okay. So when an ADU or a junior unit is proposed, does the septic system have to be upgraded?
Yeah, so an ADU will still have to, or a septic system on a property will still have to have the allowed number of bedrooms as is proposed on the property. So they might have to expand their septic system if the capacity isn't currently available. So they still have to meet all water and sanitation requirements.
And are there sewer fees charged?
For conversions of existing space, sewer connections cannot be charged, no.
But are there fees? Are there fees to be paid by the property owner?
There are connection fees for new construction ADUs.
Okay.
It depends
So
on the
there
district,
is
though.
at least a somewhat of an ability to keep the infrastructure up with the units that are proposed. I was curious as to why you mentioned in the staff report that groundwater 4 areas are still going to be subject to the net zero water use. I'm just wondering why not groundwater class 3 areas? Would that not also be part of that the standard? I guess that still requires a well yield, right?
Yeah, so class 4 or class 3 and class 4 areas still require a well yield test, and that's part of the building code. The class 4 requirements for net zero groundwater use, that was something that was originally put into the ADU ordinance, I think in 2018, and we've carried that through to this proposed ordinance.
And I'm sorry, just a couple more things. You said in the staff report that the state did not put a cap on the size of converted space ADUs. But in your just presentation, you mentioned that the proposed ordinance establishes a 1,200 square foot maximum. Is that the case? Is that something that we are doing, or is that mandated by state law?
So
new cap.
New construction ADUs will be limited to 1,200 square feet, but conversions of existing space are part of a class of ADUs that are generally are exempt from development standards in the state law, and that includes unit size. So that means, for example, a 2,000 square foot residential accessory structure could be converted to an ADU without requiring it to be 1,200 square feet. And then that conversion would be limited to only a 150 square foot expansion, simply for the purpose of ingress and egress. However, if a smaller accessory structure wanted to be converted, we wouldn't limit them to that 150 square foot expansion. We would allow them to go up to 1,200 square feet, which was the maximum in the existing ordinance.
Because since the state didn't impose a maximum size, is it within our jurisdiction to do that?
Unfortunately, no. It's a class of ADUs that we can't apply development standards to. They're just exempt. Subject to very specific criteria in the state law.
I was going to ask the same question about the Williamson Act fix. Do we have the latitude to limit to retain the current limit on ADUs in the Williamson Act?
Perhaps council could speak a little bit more to that because we did look into it. Krista, do you mind?
Commissioner Carr,
Hi, Krista.
Staff recommended that the Williamson Act provisions be removed from this ordinance because the compatible usage really should be decided through the uniform rules, and that is going to be looked at separately. The state agency that is responsible for enforcing state ADU law, the Department of Housing and Community Development,
Yes, sir.
has advised
Shaw,
that we should not.
Currently, I've cut out.
Am I cutting out?
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's within our latitude to keep that restriction under the Williamson Act, given that there are so many different types of units that, in addition to the density units that are allowed on ag land, it just seems, a little bit much. And so I guess I'm wondering if it wouldn't be within our right as a county to say, no, we're still going to continue to restrict these under Williamson Act properties.
Commissioner, you may wish to recommend to the Board of Supervisors that it look at including a provision of that nature in the uniform rules.
Right. I think the question is that it's, the uniform rules are separate from zoning. So I think you understand that. So they're not within the Planning Commission's purviews to change. The Williamson Act is a contractual a relationship that in exchange for entering into a contract and agreeing to preserve land for agricultural use, owners get a substantial tax, property tax break. So I think we certainly could ask the board to look into that, but I think council would want time to sort of research that and maybe consult the State Department of Conservation to see, what latitude we have, because there's sort of competing state policies there.
Okay, thanks.
Through the
that's
chair,
very-
Commissioner Carr, also on Williamson Act properties, there's the allowance for residences that aren't allowed in other types of non-contracted land, such as a farm family unit. So it meets the same kind of intent of providing a more affordable housing. It just has a different name and is subject to a different criteria.
Gotcha. Okay, that's fine. I'm looking forward to, I think the kind of ADU problems that I've run into down here with a couple of neighborhood objections and stuff have to do with these objective standards, that objective or subjective standards. And I guess we don't have that list yet of which ones will be considered objective and which ones will not. I think the things that have been raised here are things like the tree protection ordinance, the scenic standards along the corridors and stuff like that. I'm not looking for an answer to that now. I just pointing that out for folks, that seems to be where the bounce back is to some degree on this, the ADUs. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Davis?
Yeah, just a couple things. An obvious no-brainer on the ADUs is garage conversions. But I know there are some areas that required covered parking, and I'm curious if staff has anything to say about replacement parking, if it's necessary, if we're converting a garage and you are required to have parking. Are you still required to have parking? Is that a policy that the county would consider looking at? All right, it's. How many of us actually have a car in our garage? I know some people do. There you go. So anyway, just something there to look at. And then also, I know we just did the big, my favorite topic, Z overlays. We just removed, I was like 2,000 parcels or something. We removed the Z overlay from in ag zones, which is fabulous and a great start there. I would hope that wherever we end up today, that, the commission would also consider sending a message to the board to have staff, take a look at what existing Z overlays remain and consider, those areas where it might be appropriate to do removal. Thank you.
And that's also along the lines of a comment I think we received yesterday from a commenter by email. About asking about the Z overlays, and along with another comment about urging LAFCO to do something. I guess staff, do you have any response with regard to those comments?
Yeah, through the chair, I'll first address Commissioner Davis's comments. So ADUs are specifically protected from requiring replacement parking in the state law, but JDUs were not given those specific protections. And so staff's intent with this ordinance was really to restore what the county had before that was not overridden by state law, and then include those state law provisions that were not originally included. So we didn't explore any policy options like not requiring replacement parking for JDUs, but if that's something the commission wants us to explore, we can do that. It would be a simple change in the ordinance, but I know parking is a concern. And so that is something that's possible for us to look into. And then your second comment about Z removal, yeah, this draft ordinance update is not related to Z removal or does not include any plans for Z removal, but the housing element update process is coming up, and that would be the ideal opportunity for us to look into further Z removals. The agricultural Z removal that happened in 2019 was a policy option in the housing element. So that would be something that might be directed through this upcoming update. And then Commissioner Tamura, maybe Nina Bellucci might want to comment on the public comment that you guys received yesterday regarding LAFCO and their policy for outside service area agreements. She knows a little bit more about it than I do.
Yeah, the LAFCO issue is sort of depends on what the individual agreements or what the agreements, the outside service area agreements for that area say about additional units. Some prohibit any more than one single family dwelling connection. Some are a little more permissive. And certainly any urban area Z removal that we do, because so many of the urban areas like Cannon Manor and the South Wright area have to do, they were applied for reasons related to water quality and septic capacity and sewer service. So any mass Z removal that we undertook as part of the housing element implementation would have to explore those LAFCO issues in a little more depth and work with LAFCO to understand what the constraints for each of those areas are.
Okay. Thank you. I guess the other thing I noticed about the comments is, urge LAFCO to do something. I'm not sure that's really in our purview as the planning commission to do that. This is, we're the issue before us is an ordinance, right? Okay. Any other commissioner comments for staff? Okay.
Commissioner, Mr. Chairman, on that last issue, just for informational purposes only, I know that when LAFCO allowed sewer extension to failing septic system areas outside of the urban boundaries, they included a provision that would not induce additional growth beyond just what's necessary in sewer capacity to resolve the septic and water quality problems. So that would be a significant growth issue outside of the sewered areas for the county and the cities to the extent that they might be involved. So just that's not an easy one to deal with.
Yeah. Okay.
And if I could just pipe up because I can, in the South Wright area, my understanding was that Z overlay was put in, and I realize I'm going off on a tangent, but I'll just say it anyway. That the Z overlay was applied when the sewer came in because the city of Santa Rosa wasn't prepared to deal with all the extra hookups, but there is sewer at this point. So it's it's changing conditions there. So anyway, and the city is willing to do it. So anyway, my little poke at LAFCO, and I will drop it like a hot potato now.
Okay, thank you. All right, any other commissioner comments for staff? Okay, I'd like to open it up for public comment on this agenda item. Okay, and again, just remember it's Alt-Y. Oh, I see a hand there. We've got one person.
So I see a Charles Lackman, and is it going to be 2 minutes for this item, Jared Tamura?
I think for this particular item, it can be 3 minutes, our usual 3 minutes, just because we don't have that many commenters and we're already ahead of schedule here.
Okay, Charles Lackman is the only person at the moment. Charles, you should be able to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Our neighborhood, I live in the Hessel neighborhood, and we had a ADU being built on a private road that we all share. But the ADU actually had a public address, but they also had, potentially there was access to the private road. And to get what was proposed was a large pre-built structure that would have required a lot of tree removal on the private road because it was so narrow. Anyway, I would suggest that you look at access on private road to ADUs and the impact that it might cause, especially if an option is from a public street. Even though the parcel may have access to the private road, it would seem to me that it's reasonable to say the access should be the address of the public address that the parcel is actually registered with. That's just, I think you'd get less people concerned against ADUs if you avoided that issue by sticking to public streets rather than allowing construction equipment, et cetera, to go on private streets. And when I say private, I mean privately maintained.
Okay. Thank you for your comment.
And at this time, we do not have any other hands up. So if anyone would like to speak on this item, this is your moment.
I guess I'd also be interested in hearing staff's response to that comment, as long as we're on that topic.
Well, it looks like we don't have any more public comment. So if we're good to.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I would like to close the public comment period first. Yes, thank you. Katrina, did you want to respond to that commenter question?
Yeah, through the chair. I'm not sure I completely understand the circumstances that he was describing or the particular ADU that was proposed. But the state law and our county code doesn't differentiate between access from a public or private road. So an ADU would be permitted regardless.
Okay, so we don't really have control over it because the state law says, okay.
Correct.
I understood the comment in the sense that he was saying that basically if somebody's bringing something in and it has other impacts as far as taking down trees and all that. But sounds like we may not have leeway there. Okay.
Correct.
All right. I don't have any other comments. Okay, do I hear a motion from any of the commissioners?
I'd be happy to move approval with the changes as described by the errata, if you want to call it that, approved, submitted by staff regarding the new zoning code. And the, I'm sorry, my notes and the multifamily, I just have little hand scratch notes on that. So, but anyway, with the proposed changes by staff.
I'll second.
Sorry, who is the second? Just so I can.
Commissioner Diaz.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to a roll call vote. Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Ocaña.
Aye.
Commissioner Diaz.
Aye.
Commissioner Davis.
Aye.
And Chair Tsumura.
Aye.
And then just to confirm, so this is a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors. So there is no appeal period on this item.
Okay. And I think we're just slightly before, we had a 1:50 start time for agenda item 2. So I think we can't start it until 1:50, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, all right. Well, I guess we'll have a recess until 1:50.
Okay.
Commissioners Carr and Diaz, could you please change your name so it says Commissioner in front? That was something we've been trying to do just in general, so the audience can easily identify you as commissioners.
Commissioner Carr, I'll go ahead and take care of it.
I'm sorry, I already got into it, Scott.
Okay, and I have 150 on my clocks. So can we open it up to the, or are we already opened up to attendees? I guess we are.
Yes, we're already open. The staff on this item will be the Comprehensive Planning Manager, Brian O, Supervising Planner, Hannah Spencer, and Project Planner, Georgia McDaniel.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Director. The item is item number 2. I think a lot of people in the audience are waiting for, ORD 16-0001, with regard to winery events. And please go ahead with your presentation, staff.
Good afternoon, members of the Planning Commission and members of the public. I am Georgia McDaniel, the project planner for winery events. Hannah Spencer, supervising planner, and Brian O, comprehensive planning manager, are also here today. The purpose of the hearing is to consider amendments to the county zoning code, adding standards for new winery events and tasting rooms. Next. Today's agenda will cover the winery events policy history, the draft winery events ordinance, policy analysis, an overview of local area guidelines prepared by citizen advisory groups, and staff's recommendation. Next. In 1989, the agricultural resources element was added to the general plan, including policies that allow agricultural promotional activities that are compatible with the agricultural use of the land. These policies were implemented in the 1993 zoning code update, specifying that ag promotional uses are allowed in agricultural zoning districts by use permit, and that occasional cultural events, including non-agricultural related events, are allowed by zoning permit. The 2008 general plan update expanded on policies regulating winery events and promotional activities. Over the years, the wine industry has increasingly shifted the mode of wine marketing to focus on direct-to-consumer sales. This shift has driven an increase in promotional activities and events that bring customers to agricultural areas for wine release parties, winemaker dinners, industry-wide events, and other gatherings that have, in some circumstances, resulted in neighborhood impacts and potential land use conflicts. Next. The winery events policy effort began in December 2014, when, in response to growing concerns, the Board of Supervisors adopted a work plan that included developing regulations to address winery events and potential overconcentration of wineries and tasting rooms. In 2016, the board held 2 study sessions and adopted a resolution directing staff to initiate zoning code amendments to address key issues associated with winery events. During a winery events policy update in 2020, the board directed staff to obtain additional public input and move forward with preparing a countywide ordinance that defines key terms and addresses common issues identified across the local guidelines that have been prepared by advisory groups for areas of overconcentration, which include the Dry Creek Valley, West Side Road, and Sonoma Valley area. Next. Permit Sonoma has been addressing cumulative impacts as part of the winery events policy effort. GHD was contracted by Permit Sonoma to prepare traffic studies for the local areas of concentration, one for Dry Creek Valley and West Side Road, and one for Sonoma Valley. Many of the recommendations in those studies are now conditions of approval for use permits. Ballard Acoustical Consultants was contracted by Permit Sonoma to prepare noise screening criteria for applications to ensure compliance with the noise element of the general plan. The Ballard setback requirements are included in the draft winery event ordinance. Groundwater related standards such as groundwater monitoring, reporting, plus water conservation plans are now applied to projects, as well as zero net water use policy and procedures in high habitat value watersheds for Coho, Steelhead. Next. Community input on the winery events policy began in 2015 when the Winery Events Working Group was formed by Permit Sonoma Director Witt. The working group included representatives from industry and neighborhood groups met for 6 months. Public input was also received at a large public workshop in 2015, plus 2 board study sessions held in 2016. Local advisory committees and stakeholder groups began meeting on this effort in 2016 and continue to provide feedback to Permit Sonoma. Most recently, Permit Sonoma held a virtual workshop on developing the framework for the winery events ordinance in February. Next. The emerging themes from the latest workshop and comments received over the last 3 months are: size is a major determining factor whether an activity is an activity or an event. Food and wine pairing is not an event, whereas serving a full meal would be. Activities or parties held during normal business hours are normal business activities, whereas after hours would be an event. Wine industry meetings and parties with wine trade partners are not part of normal operations, not an event. And lack of monitoring and enforcement results in direct negative impacts to neighbors. Public comments also indicate a concern for how existing wineries will be affected by the new winery events ordinance, which brings me to my next point. The winery events ordinance would apply only to new and modified use permit applications for wineries and tasting rooms. All existing wineries would continue to operate under their current use permit conditions of approval. An existing winery may apply to modify their use permit if, for example, the winery events ordinance is less restrictive than their use permit. If an existing winery permit requires clarity, Permit Sonoma will review those use permits and provide a consistency of determination on a case-by-case basis, which when required by the winery. Wineries that have been operating prior to the adoption of zoning regulations for agricultural promotional activities continue to be subject to the non-conforming uses article of the zoning code. Now I'm going to hand off the presentation to Hannah.
Thank you, Georgia. Good afternoon, Chair Tamura, commissioners, and members of the public. My name is Hannah Spencer, Supervising Planner with Permit Sonoma, and I'm working closely with Georgia McDaniel and Brian O on this policy effort. And today I'm going to provide an overview of the Winery Events Ordinance. As directed by the Board of Supervisors, staff has drafted a Winery Events Ordinance that provides clarity and consistency to the permitting process for wineries and tasting rooms, and helps to protect agricultural lands and rural character by reducing event-related impacts. The ordinance achieves these objectives by defining key terms, establishing operating standards, and by distinguishing normal business activities from events. The winery standards would be used as evaluation criteria by Permit Sonoma and decision makers when considering applications for winery events and tasting rooms that are located in the 3 ag zoning districts, which are land intensive agriculture, land extensive agriculture, and diverse agriculture. The ordinance does not apply to any property within the coastal zones. Definitions for the list of terms shown here are included in the winery standards proposed by the ordinance. Many of these terms have to an extent been defined over the years in use permit conditions of approval for wineries. However, conditions of approval have evolved over time due to changes in industry needs, over concentration of visitor serving uses, and community concerns. For example, food and wine pairing is included in the majority of winery and tasting room applications that we see today, whereas 20 years ago, this activity was not considered as one of the primary functions of the tasting room. 20 years ago, conditions of approval related to food and wine pairing were pretty vague until starting in 2015, these conditions became very restrictive with regard to the limited number of seats and square footage of tasting area, and also prohibiting service during the lunch hour. Over the past few years, though, standard conditions of approval for food and wine pairing have changed again, and for the most part have become less restrictive. By codifying definitions for these key terms, we can improve consistency and bring clarity to the permitting process for applicants, neighbors, staff, and decision makers. The ordinance also includes operating standards for sizing, maximum hours of operation, parking requirements, clarification on food service limitations, standards on event coordination and traffic management, and setbacks for noise reduction. In this table, we are showing you how the ordinance distinguishes winery visitor serving activities from winery events. The staff report includes a similar table, but we added distinctions here on parking and frequency in this example. It's important to note that all winery visitor serving uses are subject to their individual use permit conditions of approval. However, the ordinance provides the baseline standards for these typical operations. Sales and wine trade activities are considered part of normal business operations. Wine trade activities are distinct from sales in that wine trade is limited to wine industry attendees only. They may have longer operating hours and serve meals during their employee harvest parties or seminars, for example. Sales activities such as wine tasting and pickup parties may be attended by anyone, occur anytime during their approved normal business hours, and offer wine and food pairing or incidental sales of local packaged food products, but not meals. Food service limitations are important in the ag zones because the general plan explicitly prohibits new restaurants in these areas. However, by allowing limited food service as a part of normal operations, we can balance the needs of industry with preventing over-commercialization of our agricultural lands. In contrast, winery events are not considered part of normal business operations, as they tend to draw larger crowds and result in the potential for more offsite impacts. Event types include agricultural promotional events and industry-wide events, all of which are required to be related to wine sales and education in order to be found with the existing general plan agricultural resource policies. Industry-wide events are limited to their typical hours of operation between 10 to 5 p.m. and ag promotional events between 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. Events may offer food service, including meals, and accommodate their larger events by using unimproved overflow parking or a shuttling system. Because events are not considered part of normal business operations, the maximum number of event days allowed per year would be specified in the individual use permit. Another distinction made between winery events and activities is that events would be required to provide an on-site event coordinator and send annual notices to neighbors informing them of the coordinator's contact information in cases where complaints need to be addressed. And this approach is similar to Permit Sonoma's requirements for the vacation rental property management program. The winery standards also require traffic management and parking plans for all activities and events to ensure sufficient parking and access is maintained on site. And for the larger events, the traffic management plan would need to include provisions for addressing local traffic delays and include parking attendants to queue traffic and enforce the on-street parking restriction. Our last standard covers noise setbacks. As Georgia mentioned earlier in this presentation, Permit Sonoma contracted with the noise consultant as a part of the winery events policy effort to provide thresholds for determining when a winery event would exceed the general plan noise standards at the property line. The setbacks provided in this ordinance are also incorporated into Permit Sonoma's noise guidelines for the preparation of noise assessments. And these are guidelines that Permit Sonoma already hands out to noise consultants to help them with the preparation of their noise studies for various project types. By codifying these noise setbacks, we can encourage applicants to address noise impacts early in the project design phase. And the graphic shown here is an example of a winery that includes parking and outdoor spaces for events and tasting. The site is located near residences on adjacent properties to the northwest. These residences are considered noise-sensitive uses. In this case, the winery's parking lot and outdoor tasting pavilion meet the noise setbacks from the property line of the nearest residence. However, the outdoor event area with amplified music is located fairly close to this shared property line, which is highlighted in red. And therefore, staff would have to require a noise study be completed for this project to ensure the noise impacts are reduced and comply with existing general plan noise standards. The noise impact reduction measures are specific to individual projects and their on-site constraints, but they typically include sound walls or relocating event areas away from the nearest residence. And that concludes the overview of the proposed ordinance. And I'm going to hand the presentation back to Georgia now to cover policy analysis, local guidelines, and staff's recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Next. Staff finds that the proposed ordinance is consistent with the general plan and zoning. Next. Staff finds the proposed ordinance is CEQA exempt under section 15308 and general rule section 15061B3. Next. I would like to briefly cover the relationship of local area guidelines with the county winery guidelines. Significant shifts in the mode of marketing and selling of wine has resulted in wineries of all sizes moving to a distribution model that focuses on direct-to-consumer sales. The shift has driven an increase in wine functions and events that brings customers to agricultural areas of the county. In 2016, one of the key issues and concerns that emerged during the working group meetings was the commercialization of agricultural lands and concentration. In the 2016 board study session, the geographical locations of wineries according to the viticulture were identified. 3 specific geographical areas of concentration were also identified: Dry Creek Valley, West Side Road, and Sonoma Valley. Next. The winery events ordinance works in partnership with local area guidelines that have been or are being prepared by stakeholders and citizen advisory groups for the 3 areas of local concentration. The local guidelines provide a local framework for evaluating new or modified use permit applications in a specific area of concentration and are based on the unique conditions in that specific local area of concentration. Currently, projects go before the Dry Creek Valley Citizens Advisory Council, CAC, or the Sonoma Valley Citizens Advisory Commission, whichever is appropriate. After reviewing a project, the Citizen Advisory Group provides advisory recommendations for the project to Permit Sonoma, Board of Zoning Adjustments, the Planning Commission, and our Board of Supervisors. The Dry Creek Valley CAC guidelines were approved by the board in 2018. The Sonoma Valley CAC adopted their guidelines last week and will go before the board later this year. At this point, there is no consensus for local guidelines in the West Side Road area, but staff will continue to support stakeholders on their guidelines development. Next. This flow chart shows you how the winery standards included in the winery event ordinance would be added to the permit review process for wineries and tasting rooms. You can see here the process largely remains unchanged, with the final product being a staff report. all winery projects would be reviewed in accordance with the new winery standards. If the project is within a CAC boundary, that CAC reviews the project and coordinates with their local guidelines for wineries and provides an advisory recommendation on the application. Advisory group recommendations are included in the staff report for consideration by decision makers. Winery and tasting room projects remain subject to environmental review, often require site-specific studies such as traffic, water, and biological assessments, and are required to ensure impacts are avoided or mitigated. These discretionary applications require a public hearing and can only be approved if found to be compatible with the health, safety, and general welfare of the neighborhood. Next. That brings us to our conclusion. The ordinance meets the intent of the board by including winery standards that define key terms and set baseline standards for winery visitor serving uses, using information obtained from years of stakeholder and community input. These standards will help reduce off-site impacts and improve consistency and clarify the permitting process. The ordinance is responsive to years of community and stakeholder input. Next. The recommendation of staff is for the Planning Commission to approve the resolution recommending that the Board of Supervisors adopt the draft ordinance for winery visitor serving activities and events. And that concludes our presentation. Hannah Spencer, Brian O, and I are available to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Georgia. And I neglected to ask front if commissioners had any disclosures with regard to this item. Commissioner Kanya.
Yes, so I met with the Sonoma County Vintners Government Relations Committee, and then I also attended the staff workshop with the industry folks and neighborhood communities. And then I've also met with the two representatives from Preserve Rural Sonoma County, Christina Meyer and Mark Bommersbach.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Diaz.
I spoke with Michael Haney and Mark Bommersbach and Ridgely Evers, who's a winemaker. So a couple of people from both sides, but nothing that's not reflected in the public record.
Thank you. Commissioner Carr?
I couldn't begin to list the number of people that I've talked to about this stuff. I know Georgia and Brian are both laughing. I worked with the Citizens Advisory Committee members, the ad hoc members, and the commission in Sonoma Valley, so I was involved in that more as a facilitator as much as anything else. I have talked with industry folks and neighborhood groups over the years, and yeah, I think that's probably enough for this particular item. Thanks.
It's again, I think the purpose of the disclosure is mainly to disclose anything that's not already in the public record for this item. Please, we can focus on that. I think Commissioner Davis, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I will mimic what Commissioner Carr said. You know, been involved in numerous conversations over the year, nothing specific to, you know, in the last month.
Okay, and I spoke with Mark Bommersbach, who reached out to me by phone within the last week or two. I can't remember exactly. I have attended a presentation by Michael Haney in the industry group several years ago, as well as there was a, I can't remember what it was called, Director Orr, but there was a thing for the commissioners, I want to say roughly a couple years ago, where we traveled around and looked at worker housing issues, various issues that the industry had, and I can't remember what that was called.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, the previous deputy director did have a special meeting of the planning agency that went to a number of sites looking at a farm worker housing unit and I believe a couple wineries.
Okay, so sorry I didn't asked for that earlier, but with the presentation over, before we open public comment, I'd like to find out if any commissioners have questions for staff. Commissioner Carr.
A couple questions. George, I wonder, could you put up that slide showing the permitting process? Again, that one of the last slides in your group there. I think there's a unfortunate confusion over that process with respect to the Sonoma Valley Citizens Advisory Commission. And you notice in purple on the right, it places the CAC advisory recommendation after the staff review and preparation of a staff report. That's not the case for the Sonoma Valley CAC. Their review occurs at the referral stage. So it would actually go between the application received and be part of the winery standards review process, I guess, before it goes to staff and paperwork. Is there a proposed change here in this process that I'm just not aware of, or what's going on?
So, through the chair, I'll jump in here. So there's not a proposed change in the process. It's really more about when that information, gets kind of synthesized and how it's, brought forth to the decision maker. So it's not to say that the staff review is happening completely independent. The CAC advisory is incorporated in the staff review, and we frequently will look at the CAC minutes and the issues discussed at the meeting to further analyze certain things. For instance, we often see that the Sonoma Valley CAC will mention, groundwater on a specific project. So we'll be extra sure that any questions asked during that meeting get addressed as part of the report.
Okay, yeah, as long as there's no change in the process, I think that'll work fine. So you mentioned that the Sonoma Valley CAC recommended local guidelines would go to the board this year. Will those be coming through the Planning Commission as well, or are those just sort of adopted by the board by resolution? Is that how that's done?
Through the chair, Brian O with Permit Sonoma. The closest thing we would want to align with is the similar process we did with Dry Creek. So I believe that was the path. It was straight to the Board of Supervisors.
And what path was that?
The path was straight to the Board of Supervisors.
Okay.
However, that's not to say that after that happens, that an update at a planning agency meeting
right, sure,
probably be a good idea.
I'm mostly concerned that folks that were involved in this know what to expect in terms of the steps. So one of the things that is troubling me about reading this and going through is a difference in definitions. For example, there's a big difference in the definitions in the Sonoma guidelines versus the proposed definitions here. And in the end, would it not make sense to have everyone using the same definitions, even if there might be different policies or regulations?
Through the chair, I'd like to answer that, Commissioner Carr. So ideally, we would have a consensus on definitions with the county definitions and across the CAC definitions. But this policy has evolved over the years. Dry Creek Valley CAC completed their guidelines early on in this policy effort. 2018, I believe, is when the Board of Supervisors approved their guidelines. And so then, in the meantime, had been working with Sonoma Valley CAC and stakeholders group, as you know, and so each group had decided on a different set of definitions. So it left the county in a place, a little bit of a difficult place here to find to reach consensus on finding definitions that would be similar to both types of guidelines that already have been approved by the CACs.
Okay, well, we'll see how that goes, I guess. It looks like the definition of winery events includes the policies and regulations and standards apply to wineries as well as tasting rooms. So I'm assuming that a standalone tasting room would still be subject to the standards under the winery standards.
That is correct.
Yeah, and so the third part of that is, what about events that occur in a vineyard that don't occur either at a winery or in a tasting room, but they occur on agriculturally zoned land, such as a vineyard? Are those subject to these regulations?
Yes, all winery events occurring on within the 3 ag zones would be subject to these regulations.
I thought the question was with regard to non-wineries, though.
No, my question had to do with vineyard events, and I guess we get to it later, but I'm going to be looking to make sure it's clear that if someone has an event in a vineyard next to a winery, or on a property next to a tasting room, that those are also considered to be part of these under the operation of these standards. So maybe that's just
can I clarify your question? Are you saying a parcel that has no winery at all? It is a pure the entire legal parcel has no winery or tasting room use. Is that your
right next door to
your question? Right. But another parcel next to it has a use permit for a winery.
Council, I'm happy to take this one. So ultimately, the ability to have events stems from either an approved use permit or a zoning permit for an occasional or periodic event. So a standalone vineyard parcel that is not associated with the use permit could not have events.
Aren't there, I thought we saw some comments from CAF and some other groups about separating out agriculture. Is that for permits where they already have allowance for events? I thought there were some agricultural, like promotional events or something like that for the non-wineries. If it's just growing, I saw some comments about that in the record, and I was just curious. I wanted to make sure that was clear. So you're saying right now they couldn't have any at all, or are there some?
Yeah, there are some, through the chair. Well, you are the chair. There are some use permits that where there is not a tasting room, where there's a winery and processing, but and may have events too. So I thought I would mention that.
Just to be clear, I'm talking about agricultural, right? So not even a winery.
Right.
So maybe those comments will come up during those specific examples may come up during public comment, and we could specifically address them.
Yeah. Okay. We have some written ones. That's why I wanted to ask about it. So go ahead, Commissioner Kanya.
Can I jump on? I think one perfect example is this is almost setting a precedence for what we may encounter with cannabis events. So you've got, if we have agricultural land where we have cannabis growing on it, and you've got businesses that are wanting to have industry-wide events, is this something that's going to set a precedence for how those events should be, regulated?
I would say that the underlying principles of wanting to address impacts first and foremost, that's still going to apply. But the regulatory setting is extremely different in that there's actually a state license related to cannabis events as well. So it's more than just the local requirements. But under the current ordinance, current law of the land, cannabis permits cannot have events.
Just one more question, Mr. Chairman. Thanks. So it appears to me that this ordinance and the standards allow for ag promotional events with a fairly narrow definition of those events, and do not allow any other events, any events that are not ag promotional. Except there's one part of the definition that says or similar events, which makes it a little bit unclear. I guess I'm wondering what the intention is. Is the intention here that there would no longer be things like weddings or concerts or bar mitzvahs or any of the you know, the more of the cultural, commercial events, I think is what Mr. Martini called them, what we called them in Sonoma Valley, private events. Is the intention that those events would not be allowed except by zoning permit? Is that what's going on with this proposal?
Through the chair, I'll answer that. So the intention is to bring some clarity to the existing requirements of the general plan resources element. And so the agricultural resources element, as we know, allows these ag promotional activities, but they all have to be related to the agricultural production, either occurring on site or within the area, and be incidental and secondary to those ag production activities. So the intent of the definitions, as the way we crafted it, was to provide simply examples of your typical ag promotional events that we often see through these use permit applications. And so it's, you know, up to the applicant to demonstrate how their event type, whichever type they request, would be consistent with the existing policies of the general plan. And if they cannot demonstrate that consistency of, you know, being related to the ag uses and incidental to that operation, there is always that the option, as you say, for the zoning permit to allow those periodic cultural events, you know, where applicants may come in every year or every other year to apply up to 4 of those periodic cultural events that do not have to be related to any agricultural activities.
And those do not involve public notification, as I recall.
They actually do. We are required to post 10-day notices for those zoning permits. And so we give the public, the neighborhood, a chance to appeal staff's administrative decision to approve those zoning permits, subject to an appeal fee. And then that would bring, if appealed, we would have to bring that zoning permit decision before the Board of Zoning Adjustments before the applicant could hold their event.
And at this point, though, there's nothing in this draft ordinance that provides any further clarity as to what would be considered an ag promotional event, other than the examples that you cited in your definition.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Any other commissioner comments for staff? Commissioner Kanya.
I just had a very simple logistical question and perhaps a follow-up. From the flow chart, it appears that every single event would eventually end up in front of the BZA for approval. Is that correct, or is this ordinance supposed to allow for staff to waive that process and automatically allow events that pertain, you know, were under the guise of this ordinance to go forward without BZA involvement?
Through the chair, so the slide, the permitting process flow chart was just to, our intent was to provide an example of how really our planning review process is not changing for use permits for wineries or their events or tasting rooms. So the standard process is the use permit goes before the Board of Zoning Adjustments or possibly Planning Commission, and then sometimes the Board of Supervisors. But the zoning code also allows staff to administratively approve the non-controversial use permits that tend to be minor in terms of intensity and impacts. But we're only able to do that by posting notices to the public, informing them that the use permit before the BZA would be waived unless any member of the public requests that hearing. And so that's the hearing waiver calendar that's attached to this agenda is what we're referring to when we have staff at the bottom of that flow chart.
Can I just jump in real quick? Because I think that I'm hearing a different question coming from Commissioner Akanya, and so just to clarify, individual wineries aren't going to come forward with individual events unless they're actually asking for something special. part of the winery use permit process includes determining how many events, what the tasting room hours are, what's an activity, and what they're allowed to do under that use permit. Once they have that use permit, that they're entitled to do those things. If they had something outside their use permit, they'd have to come back to us. But once they've got their use permit, we do look at that, and we are the ones that make that first pass at that. So I don't know if that's kind of what I heard your question being.
It was. Thank you for clarifying that, because I guess what I really want to know is the difference between new use permits versus the grandfathered in use permits. So all new use permits will come before BZA, and then the winery will determine how many events they want to have a year, and if all of those fall under the ordinance guidelines, then they can go forward with that without returning to staff for additional permits. That's what I understand. But all the grandfathered in permits, so basically every winery that exists now, they would automatically get a bump up to be able to cover, or do they have to come to the BZA and have their particular grandfathered and use permit be reviewed again? That's what I'm just wondering, how do all of the established wineries get to use the ordinance?
So I'll take that one. So the allowances of what each winery is allowed to do is dictated by their use permit, project description, and conditions of approval. So if they were allowed to do 20 and they were approved last year, this year, regardless of what happens today, they'd still be allowed to do 20. If due to their success or failures, they wanted to change the number of events that they would do in a year from, let's say, 20 to 30, they would have to revise their use permit and come back to the BZA for a decision. With minor modifications or in some cases renewals, we do see that more often there's not a large appetite to have a public hearing. Those are more likely to go through on waiver than a new use permit. But regardless of what happens today and with this recommendation, anytime a use permit holder wants to modify their use permit, they need to approach the county, and staff will help them with the appropriate path.
Right. So I guess I had a comment similar to Commissioner Kanya's, which was, we've got 400 odd wineries with use permits already. And if the current ordinance isn't going to apply to any of those, unless they come back for modification of some kind, do we have an estimate of how many more we might be seeing?
Well, I think it's worth, I wouldn't say that not applying is how the relationship will be. I mean, the things like definitions and saying what is an activity versus what is an event, that type of clarity is important, because in the past, there might have been a sentiment that a certain type of I don't want to use activity to define activity, but a certain type of business task could be considered an event. So this is providing clarity on what is daily operation and what is an event. So just because a winery may have been approved in 1992 or 2001, I mean, the application of those definitions still applies, and I think is a benefit to the use permit holders. And if I meandered around your question without answering it, I apologize.
No, you did a good job, actually. That helped clarify for me, because certainly a lot of the comments that we saw prior to today, the written comments, indicated that this was applying to existing. And then the thing that stuck out at me most during the presentation was that, oh, this only applies to new permits. So the definitions actually do apply. And I guess my concern is that, one of the problems that's been in the past is that there's been different interpretations. Commissioner Carr was mentioning there's been some different definitions. And all of a sudden, with this, it's going to change some interpretations that have been made in the past, some of which may or may not be contentious. And it may really impact, the businesses and or the residents nearby. And I guess I haven't seen an analysis of that. And I imagine it would be very hard to do that analysis. I recognize that. This is not an easy task for staff.
Right. Well, one benefit to, new use permits is they now know what the guidelines are, if there are guidelines for their area. Whereas in the past, it was, maybe you talk with, neighborhood groups or your immediate neighbors or the county. But that's a big difference from having adopted guidelines that are public and well known, so that as you're planning your project, you can come into it knowing what that area is expecting.
Yes, no, I understand that for new projects, I think that is, but what I'm saying is for existing permits, my concern is that those terms were written before these definitions came out, and now these definitions are going to change those things. Right? Is that my understanding correct?
Can I make a suggestion on this?
Yeah.
I was hoping to have a conversation about this after we went through the ordinance and made our decisions on this, because I think talking about the grandfathering issue that a number of people have raised is going to be a lengthy conversation, and it's probably not going to involve too many of us as much as it's going to involve the attorneys for the county. But I do think that it would be worth having a little conversation maybe after we've finished our deliberation.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, thank you, Commissioner Carr. I appreciate that. I would like to give Commissioner Diaz an opportunity to comment. I think he has had a hand up for a while.
I did, but those were some of my questions too. A couple of questions I had regarding enforcement of permissible activities once a permit has been issued. What are our enforcement options? Like in the case of somebody acting out of their permit, but even like we call out locally sourced food, but how do we actually verify that? Or I know we call for coordinators. But one of the things I know is in the construction industry, you often get a construction coordinator who's tasked with talking to neighbors, but they kind of exist in name only. They don't really do much. What are the county's enforcement options for when things come up and issues are getting contentious at a site?
Can you take that, Scott? Or Hannah?
Sure, I'll just take a first stab at it. So our county is complaint-based with regard to code enforcement. So if we receive any code enforcement complaints, code enforcement staff work closely with the project planner and managers who are assigned to that use permit, or at least that general area, and we'll work with the winery and the applicants to determine, whether or not their services are consistent with their approved use permit conditions of approval. And if the violations become egregious enough and it's clear that the applicant is not complying with their approved use permit conditions of approval, then all use permits include a provision where staff may bring that project back to the Board of Zoning Adjustments to review those violations and neighborhood impacts, whatever the complaints are, and have basically a second round of review on those conditions, whether or not the permit may need to be revoked.
Yeah, I actually have a related question to Commissioner Diaz's question, which was, enforceability of some of these provisions. Was code enforcement consulted with regard to the drafting of this and the enforceability of these provisions?
We've talked with the manager of code enforcement, Tira Harrington, to learn about, the average number of winery complaints. And I know this doesn't answer your question, but what they see are about 5 complaints a year countywide. So it seems to be fairly insignificant. And the enforceability, I would imagine it is difficult, unless we don't have, resources to be screening every winery's website to see what kind of menus they offer. But if these complaints, that's our opportunity as a project planner to work with the winery, reach out and possibly work with the BZA if needed to address those violations.
Okay, yeah, because I know, and I think Georgia's presentation, she mentioned that one of the issues that the community groups had in the past was enforceability. So, yes, obviously, I understand what you said before about complaint-based and that sort of thing. But I think, even when you have a complaint, if it gets too specific, I think it becomes pretty hard for code enforcement to really effectively enforce it. And I was just wondering if anybody had done a screen on that.
Through the chair, I had a discussion with code enforcement, and the complaints were that they have received have turned into violations. And when there is a violation there, it allows code enforcement to take certain actions.
Yes, no, I understand that. That was sort of a separate issue, and I guess I should revise what I said before. You know, if it's not specific enough, that can lead to problems too. I guess, you know, Commissioner Diaz mentioned, you know, locally sourced foods. Like, well, okay, so you start throwing in terms that are conditionals that is very hard to prove one way or the other. I think that's what gets difficult. So I think we've had enough discussion about sort of the overview. I'd like to open the public comment, and then we can have more commissioner discussion later. I see we have 92 attendees. I am going to limit the comments to 2 minutes each so we can get through this. And so I see a couple hands coming up, and Deputy Director, I'll let you admit people as you see hands.
Okay, so first it's going to be Bruce Reisenman and then Jim. And then just for the sake of our minute takers, if you could say your name when you start, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Bruce, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Name and address, right, Deputy Director?
Only name is required. If people would like
okay.
to give their address, then that's welcome.
Okay. Thank you for your time. My comment is going to be about 3 minutes and 30 seconds. If you'd bear with me, I'd appreciate it. My name is Bruce Reisman.
So, sir, you will only have 2 minutes. So if there's anything important in the last 90 seconds, I would move it up front.
Okay, it's going to be a little tough, but I'll do my best. I'm the founder of Park Avenue Catering. We've been catering activities throughout the county for 31 years, and I'd like to go over a few things with you. First, I'd like to discuss the impact of special events on our community. Over the course of each year, PAC alone hires an average of 375 people. The vast majority, over 90%, are part-time, seasonal, or on call. Most earn between $2,000 and $15,000 per year with us. Who are these people? They're teachers, hospitality workers, and retired people. They're artists who need to augment their income, students who attend the JC and SSU, or students returning home to earn some money during college break. What they all have in common is they need extra income, often simply to live in Sonoma County, or to buy a new car, or for other discretionary income that will inevitably be spent locally. When you consider community impact, please consider these people. When you consider, what I'd like to discuss next is to turn to business and what constitutes promotion and agricultural sales of agricultural products. In a word, it is impressions. Ask anyone involved in business and they'll tell you that to sell the product, whatever it is, they need to get more people to know it exists and to hear and see the brand name as many times as possible. In advertising, that is what's called impressions. But not every impression leads to a sale, just as not every person who visits the tasting room buys a case or even a bottle. But get people to have a good time at your winery and they may become club members, or at the very least, they'll Instagram their experience. They'll tell their friends, they'll buy your wine when they return home. The event or activity they attended has helped create many positive impressions, and that is what sells wine, and that is what sells Sonoma County. It sells other ag products from Sonoma County by branding both the county and our wineries as a place for food, wine, and experiences. With consolidation taking place on the winery and distribution level, it's getting more difficult to get wine out to the marketplace.
Okay, that's
sorry,
your 2
sir,
minutes.
but we're over your time.
That's my 2 minutes?
Yep.
Okay, sorry, if there's time left over, I'll raise my hand for a second shot at it.
So next up will be Jim and then Wendy.
Hi, this is Jim DeBonis, the COO at Trinity Winery. And I would suggest that as far as definition of the event, weddings should actually be specified. And I'll say why. I know that Bruce's events that he's catering, I think a large percentage of them are winery weddings. It's a huge business in the county. But here's the most important part. It is the strongest tool I have at promoting our products. People having a winery wedding here are required to buy 1 bottle for every 2 people. Those bottles sit on the dining table. They're seeing our label, they're sampling our wine. There's not a better tool to get trial of our products. It turns into over $100,000 worth of sales at weddings alone for wine. These people that attend these weddings come back to our wineries, they come to the tasting rooms, they join our wine clubs. Like I said, it is by far the most powerful tool at promoting our agricultural product, which is wine. So to avoid future confusion or people that have issue with wineries doing events and or weddings, I just think it would add a lot of clarity if that were just one of the examples listed. Thank you.
Thank you.
After Wendy, it will be Patty.
Thank you. Wendy Krupnick. I'm with Sonoma County chapter of Community Alliance with Family Farmers. And thank you for this opportunity. We did submit written comments and I won't go over all of that again, but a couple points I hope to get into my 2 minutes. To respond to your question, Commissioner Tamura, about what we were requesting to be clarified in our letter, that is language that would make sure to identify that this ordinance is just pertaining to wine events, that it does not broadly apply to other types of agricultural events. Our main concern is the primacy of preserving ag land for ag production. When acreage is developed for visitor serving buildings, patios, parking lots, etc., it becomes unavailable for agricultural production. And that is really clear in the general plan, that that is the reason why we have zoning for ag land, is that it can be preserved for this use. We're very concerned about the citizens advisory committees and the guidelines and the kind of, the recommendations, advisory, but nothing that's concrete that builds it into the ordinance. And having 3 different ones in different parts of the county, no consistency as to who is participating. It seems like the appointments can be political. They aren't uniform. It seems that it is both unfair and there's a lack of clarity to an applicant about what really is going to apply. One of our committee members has been very active in one of these advisory committees, and even he agreed that having consistency throughout the entire county, which would also prevent new areas of concentration. We were informed that, if another area becomes overconcentrated, we'll deal with it then. Well, that's after the fact.
Your 2 minutes are up. Thank you.
That's too bad. Thank you.
Great. Patty Selwyn. And then all of the hands that I have up at the moment are people who have spoken already. And I'm sure okay. Thank you, everybody who just put your hand up. Patty, you should be able to speak now.
Yes, thank you very much. The draft ordinance is a positive start. My name is Patty Selwyn. I'm with Preserve Rural Sonoma County. One gross omission that we're quite concerned about, and we sent you these comments, but I just want to reiterate that we're recommending additional siting criteria be added, because siting criteria has been part of the ordinance discussion since the winery working group several years ago. PRC proposes 4 siting criteria that address a lot of the issues that have been raised in stakeholder discussions over the past several years, and we're rather alarmed that it has not been included in your usual, pretty good draft ordinance so far. The first one is the access of minimum 18-foot countywide roadways. This was discussed in the winery working group. It's generally agreed between community groups and the wine industry that for new winery applications, there needs to be sufficient egress and access for both visitors and emergency vehicles. We know about the fire situation. We need to do safe planning. We also recommend 20-acre minimum parcel size for new wineries. There's a number of parcels in ag zones that are well below this threshold that already have use permits. And these small parcels really present a challenge because they're usually surrounded by residences, often located on rural lanes with bad access, and they draw water from wells that are in close proximity to neighbors' wells. I don't need to tell you about the drought. We all read the paper. 20-acre minimum is included in the Dry Creek guidelines and the Sonoma Valley guidelines. Then number 3, separation criteria. There should be no more winery driveways in a half a mile of each other. a separation criteria that allows a maximum of 2 wineries and a half-mile stretch of roadway will certainly address the overconcentration of winery facilities, but it could also lessen the potential for other areas in the county to become overconcentrated over time. And then last but not least, no outdoor amplified sound except under a limited number of events per zoning permit. In rural areas, sound travels significant distances, and even with
Okay.
applicant monitored
Your 2 minutes are up. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Patty. The next will be Tom Conlon and then Kathy Pons.
Thank you. Tom Conlon, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Tom Conlon here in Sonoma Valley. I appreciate the opportunity to comment. I had comments on 2 specific issues. First, the decision to find this ordinance process exempt from CEQA. I noticed that the CEQA definition that was cited states that it can be seen with certainty that there is no possibility that the activity in question may have a significant effect on the environment. And that's the basis on which you're finding that this policy will be exempt from CEQA. I also noticed that the staff has gone to look into cumulative impacts in traffic, noise, and water, and went to the trouble of commissioning traffic studies in 3 jurisdictions, I believe, to provide some quantitative data to support this finding. I have not seen any quantitative data on greenhouse gas emissions in this process. It's been raised by a number of reviewers, a number of members of the public. If there will be no negative cumulative impacts of additional trips from this policy, I am very much happy to hear that, but I do not hear any basis for that, making that finding here today. My second concern goes to the discussion of definitions, which Commissioner Carr raised, and the idea that the local jurisdictions appear to be leading the county in defining what these terms mean. Is that setting precedent in other areas of PRMD policy? And should we expect that to persist into the future for other products marketed in our county? Thank you for your consideration of my comments.
Thank you.
After Kathy Pons, it'll be Nick Fry.
Hi, my name is Kathy Pons. I agree with Patty about the need for citing criteria to be included in this ordinance. And I also want to ask about within the definition of winery events, it says winery events are secondary and incidental to agricultural production activities. How is that evaluated? Is it depending on how much they produce? Does a winery that produces more wine get more events than another one? Or how is that evaluated? Because that doesn't seem clear. The other thing is the wine trade allowances. How do we know that these events are really wine trade people when it allows them to continue on until 10 o'clock at night from tasting room hours and such. So, and weddings as promotional events, I understand how the previous commenter was talking about how it's a big tool, but it's also a big cost to the people renting the facility to have the wedding. So it also, I think, adds into the secondary and incidental definition and could be not in line with the goal of this whole ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you.
After Nick Fry will be Mark Bommersbach. Oh, sorry. Did we just hear from Kathy? Okay,
yes.
Sorry, I have a lot of hands up and some repeats.
I guess it's worth mentioning to people too that if you've already spoken, you can put your hand down, but if there's another person on your line who wants to comment, then keep the hand up. And Nick Fry, you should be unmuted now, I think.
Yeah, okay. I just want to reinforce the issue that Commissioner Carr raised. I think that the definitions need to be clearly stated. I think the tables give you some examples. I could argue with some of the decisions as to what goes in what slot. And until we get clear definitions, I don't think we have clarity for applicants or anyone. So I think that's a critical issue, and I don't think that the current draft achieves that. And then the other thing, I mentioned 5 complaints. How about the number of complaints relative to the number of comments and meetings with county staff from people who are worried about events? And I think we got to keep it in perspective. Do we have a serious problem? If we have a serious problem, deal with it. We would support dealing with a winery that isn't following the rules. And you have current limits on noise, parking requirements, septic requirements. Those things, I think, are clear. And if you're out of bounds, you're out of bounds. You have to adjust for it. I think some of the setbacks are arbitrary. If I'm have to be 650 feet away and I'm not making noise that travels past my lot line above 55 decibels, then what's the problem? So there's things in here that the consultant recommendations, they don't have any justification for why they came to their conclusion. And I'm concerned about that. So I think there's some work to be done. I think it's a good first start. There's been a lot of good dialogue, but I think we still have ways to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
After Mark, it'll be David.
This is Mark Bommersbach, and I want to focus on the CEQA discussion. I read the staff report, and it was good that it applies to modifications and new use permits. The question is, and this is the county's whole argument stands on this, is that this ordinance does not bestow any entitlements or use under current existing use permits just by the mere fact that this gets enacted. If that is not true, then the whole CEQA argument falls apart, because that's what you're basing it on, that those impacts will be evaluated when the use permit comes before the county for modification. And the discussion I was listening to amongst the commissioners did not make me feel good about that. So I think the county council and staff need to be very clear. Yes, there's some use permits out there, particularly old ones, where there's probably still some disputes about what's allowed under those use permits, but this ordinance should not change that one way or the other. And so that's really the baseline here, that to take advantage of anything. For example, a winemaker dinner, you might be limited in a use permit for how many winemaker dinners, but if you can have 365 winemaker dinners for the trade under this ordinance, does that automatically apply to a use permit that's only allowed 5 winemaker dinners? Those are the kinds of questions the board commission needs to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you.
After David, it will be Erica.
Hi, thank you. This is David Edzo Wines. Thanks, everybody. I know this is a difficult topic, and I appreciate everyone's focus and energy and passion. It's clear this is key. As a business person and entrepreneur, you know, getting these definitions right is key. I put a lot of investment into the county, and I want to make sure that I know what the rules are and I know what's doable, and I need to make a judgment based on that, whether this makes sense to operate as a business person with the rules that are established. So I hope that we all use some common sense to make sure these are defensible, make sure that they're measurable, and make sure that at the end of the day, businesses can succeed. On a second point, I'm a little confused. There's these regional, sub-regional groups, the Dry Creek Association, et cetera, that have their own definitions and have gone to great lengths at defining what events are, what activities are, how many are allowable, what the guidelines are. And I'm wondering how that fits into the big picture here that we're discussing, and whether those will be overwritten or will somehow be adapted and used, and just how those two will interplay. And the last question I have is really around in-flight use permits, modifications that are currently in flight, meaning they've been ongoing for a number of years potentially. Will those be grandfathered, or because they haven't been granted, will those be restarted and have to start over again and apply to a whole new set of ordinance definitions that are being put forward here? Or can they continue to be grandfathered and allowed to go under the guidelines that they've been established as they've gone forward in the current use permit process? Thanks very much.
Thank you.
After Erica, it will be Roger.
Hello, Erica.
Can you speak up a little bit? You're a little bit faint on our audio.
Sorry, I think that might be
you.
because there we go. Laptop is open now. Erica Stancliffe from Santa Rosa, and I would just like to echo with the definitions to see some clarity on the noise definition for amplified music. The reason I bring this up is just that what is going to be the definition for amplified regarding, is it live bands, speakers, playing on the boombox? Will this then set a precedent for production work and vineyard work with amplified music? And the reason I bring that up is that during harvest, a lot of us play music on our crush pad and in our winery, as well as in the vineyard, because we're not allowed to have earbuds in for when people are working with machinery, tractors, and things like that for safety reasons and for OSHA. So I would just like to see some clarification on that definition for noise and amplification. Thank you.
Thank you. Are people still on?
Sorry, I lived out.
You're frozen, Deputy Director.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry, I disconnected for a moment. Are we ready to move on to the next person?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So next up is Roger Peters, and then I'm out of fresh hands up. Roger, you should be able to unmute yourself.
It's a little garbled. Are we having a bandwidth issue?
So Roger, I'm going to put you back in line. As someone who's also dealing with internet issues, I might recommend that you call back in on a phone so that we can be sure to get your public comment. But I'll definitely call on you again before we get through and close the public hearing. So that being said, I have no more hands raised at this time. And I see Mike Martini is raising.
Okay.
So Mike, your hand has gone back down. I imagine you. Okay, I'm going to call on Kim Wallace. And please, everybody, I know everybody wants to get the last word in because that's just how it works, but it is going to extend this meeting by quite a bit if we have to do this after every person. So Kim, if you could go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Kim Wallace, president and second generation owner of Dry Creek Vineyard. We're here just outside the town of Healdsburg and are coming up on our 50th anniversary of being in the wine industry. We've been farming in the Dry Creek Valley since 1972. Like many in our community, the wine industry has faced extraordinary hardships over the years with our fires and smoke exposure and power shutoffs, and of course the pandemic and overall reduced tourism. Additionally, the wine market is extremely challenging, as was mentioned earlier, but with wineries really competing from all over the world for the same customers. It's really important to recognize that the traditional route to market, i.e. getting your wines in restaurant and retail, is extremely difficult with distributor consolidation. And as a result, family-owned wineries like us must rely on the ability to market directly to consumers in order to simply survive and sell our wines. Part of how we do that is through normal business activities that involve hospitality and events such as wine dinners, luncheons, release parties, wine club pickup get-togethers, wine education, etc. Without these activities, you cannot have a successful direct-to-consumer program or, frankly, a viable wine club. Limiting a winery's ability to conduct these standard business activities the way it's outlined in the ordinance currently will be the death of many and at best have very negative financial impacts on wineries of all sizes. Additionally, there is the negative economic fallout on the related hospitality industries, as Bruce mentioned earlier from Park Avenue Catering, which would greatly impact our local caterers, hotels, restaurants, virtually everything that makes Sonoma County special. So I would highly recommend that you adopt the Sonoma County Vintners guidelines and definitions and suggested revisions that have been submitted with respect to this ordinance. And I will end with just saying I think a lot more work needs to be done on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next up will be Mike Martini, and that is the last hand up I have at the moment.
By the way, Scott, for the person who was trying to comment by Zoom and they didn't have the bandwidth, did we give out a phone number to call in?
It is on the agenda.
Yes, at the top. Okay. So it's 669-990-9128. Okay. All right.
Good afternoon. My name's Mike Martini, Santa Rosa. Once more, it's been stated in the staff report that there's a concern that there is a commercialization of agricultural properties. And I'm going to remind you once more that agriculture is a commercial activity. Perhaps we should, it'd be better if I pointed out that what we have here is a conversion of agricultural lands to residential uses. Now, when it comes to complaints related to winery activities, I really think you need to check in with code enforcement, and they will tell you that they have very few complaints, and most of those are resolved with simple phone calls. Staff has pointed out the shift to direct consumer sales. It is these DTC sales that allow small producers to exist, and without these sales, only the larger producers will remain, and the landscape of small agricultural production will disappear. A use permit manages impacts of allowable uses. This is done by considering the capacity of the proposed use. It is not meant to micromanage the applicant's business model. You do not limit a church's number of weddings or funerals. You do not limit a market from the number of Taco Tuesdays. You do not limit the number of family days that a farm stand can have. You do make sure that the church or market has adequate parking and toilets. Exhibit B is a good start at definitions, but it falls short on clarity and acknowledgement of what a winery does. We agree that anything adopted here must agree with what has been adopted by the CACs. We have provided the commission with a revised Exhibit B that more clearly defines activities and events. One important change is that we have moved agricultural promotional events from agricultural promotional activities. Another is the addition of commercial events, to be specific, related to political or nonprofit fundraisers, weddings, or other corporate things. Activities are sales activities, wine trade activities, and agricultural promotional activities as defined. They are not limited by use permit if they are conducted within the operating standards to be outlined in the use permit. These include—
Okay, your 2 minutes are up, Mr. Martini.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up will be Vicki Farrow and then Michael Haney.
Hi, I'm Vicki Farrow. I live in Healdsburg, and I'm also a former member of the Dry Creek Valley Citizens Advisory Committee. And I support and agree with all of the comments that have been made by others in the wine community, so I won't repeat them. I want to make just one additional point, and that is to request that you as commissioners honor and respect the direction that was set by your supervisors in that October 16th resolution on winery events. And they asked for two very specific things: an ordinance to establish countywide definitions of events and food service, and second, citing criteria and standards to be specifically set at the local level. Definitions at the county level, citing criteria and standards at the local level. That was their resolution. And this proposed ordinance, I believe, oversteps what they resolved. They clearly believed that the local areas are in the best position to set citing criteria and standards. And as this is currently written, it would negate the local guidelines established in Dry Creek Valley. We put lots of energy into arguing, debating, and being creative about how to come up with something that we all liked. And I'd hate to see that go to waste. I totally support the idea of consistent definitions. I think there's more work to do, as others have said. I also fully support establishing local citing criteria and guidelines, but that must be done at the local level where people understand the issues. I agree that there has been great work done on this. I still believe we have a long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Michael Haney is now my last hand up.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity and time. My name is Mike Haney, and I'm the Executive Director of Sonoma County Vintners. And once again, I appreciate this opportunity. For the sake of time, I won't go into all of my comments, except to say I 100%, and Sonoma County Vintners 100% supports the comments of Kim Wallace, Mike Martini, Vicki Farrell. They covered so many of the major points that that are concerns of ours. Other concerns, as I think Nick Fry brought up as well, the county, this is not a situation or a problem that the county deals with multiple times every day. As our own enforcement agency said, they're looking at 5 complaints a year throughout the county. So I think that's something to be considered. But these definitions of business activities versus events, I can't stress enough how critical they are to our Sonoma County wine community's survival. That's what we're talking about. As was stated earlier, the restriction of the distribution market across the United States, and then combined with, as we all have experienced in the past 4 years, quite a bit of a catastrophe here, has really impacted our wine community and the multi-generational families that are involved in that over and over and over again. And they are teetering. I can tell you that. I talk to them every day. So the creation of these business activities will allow our wineries to not only recover from the impacts of the past 4 to 5 years, but also to help secure the stability and the future of our Sonoma County wine community and the thousands of those multi-generational families and businesses that each day really strive to give back to and help make our county a beautiful place to live, work, and thrive. So thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate the work that's being done.
Thank you.
Deputy Tamara, if you could maybe repeat how to raise your hand on your phone. We do have one dial-in user.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And I just want to make sure that it's not Mr. Peters.
Yes. Okay. So hang on a minute. Find those directions again. So *9 raises your hand if you're dialing in by phone. There it is.
So if you're currently dialed in, you should be able to unmute yourself and speak.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, this is Roger Peters, Sonoma Valley. I have just a little bit of confusion that perhaps you can clear up. On section 7D, I see that in food service, prepared meals are allowed in conjunction with wine trade activities and winery events. And I see over on the earlier pages on section D, catering kitchen and commercial kitchen are both defined, but they're not used anywhere else in the ordinance. So my question is, given the authorization in section 7D, does this ordinance grant any applicant a commercial kitchen? That would have a significant effect, I think, on any application, and probably might raise a question of whether your finding with respect to no application of the CEQA is valid. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and the other hands that I see up now are people that did speak already. I do ask that you lower your hand if there's not somebody else in your line. Okay. All
So
right.
I've gone ahead and lowered everybody's hands. So if there is another individual present, we're going to do one round of this, and hopefully everyone is honest.
Okay.
But
okay, I see a new person.
Deb Preston, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Afternoon, commissioners. Thank you for allowing me the time to speak. Deb Preston, Sebastopol. I am sorry that over competition among the wine industry has forced them to struggle so for their survival. However, as a rural resident, I am also sorry to witness the despoiling of the rural areas, the traffic congestion on our narrow roads, and the evening disruption of our neighborhoods. Whether it is called an event or an activity is purely academic. Everyone has far-reaching impacts. And I do support the clear definitions and criteria for all events and all activities. I would also assert that no amplified sound should be permitted. As someone has commented, sound travels relatively unimpeded across the countryside. I do support the 20-acre minimums. I agree that operating the food service area as a restaurant, cafe, deli, or any food service offering cook-to-order food should be prohibited. Our local restaurants need our protection, particularly now. And the last thing I'd like to say is to respond to one of the former commenters. The reason standards are needed is because a number of winery owners, and not all by any means, but a number, have been unresponsive to neighbors' concerns. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I see another hand up.
Ricky Stancliffe, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Ricky Trombetta Stancliffe, and I am the owner of a very small 1,500 case winery. My daughter is our winemaker, and I am the owner and operator. I want to tell you, after reading your proposed definitions, we will probably go out of business. I have worked with the Sonoma County Vintners over the last couple of years, and they have been working with all of you for the last 4 to 6 years to come up with definitions, winery definitions. It is breaking my heart to see that people who have moved into Sonoma County are putting our area of agriculture, separating it out and saying, oh, you're really not agriculture, you're something else. I have lived here since 1953. I've seen the dairy industry leave. I've seen the apple industry fall apart. Many of the farmers who are now growing grapes were in plums or apples or some other form of agriculture. We're not a lot of rich people. We didn't come here with money flowing out of our pockets. What we're asking you to do is to look at this from a business sense. I agree with Kim and with Vicky and Mike. We need good, solid definitions, but we've been trying to work with you folks about those definitions. When you talk about a catering kitchen, we're not talking about we're turning into a restaurant. We're talking about hiring people like Bruce Reisman to come and work in that kitchen. And for him to hire employees and wait staff to work. So think about the ripple effect that you're having on business in Sonoma County.
Okay, your 2 minutes are up.
Thank you, Ricky.
Thank you.
All right, we're doing a last 15 seconds of time to put up your hand to make a public comment, or we're going to move on. Heritimer, I believe that is the end of public comment.
Thank you. I'll close the public comment period and open it up for commissioner discussion. Commissioner Carr.
Well, just to start off, a couple things that came out of the testimony from the public that maybe would be good to clarify. The CEQA questions raised, and I wonder if, you know, there appears to be some confusion around whether or not creating new definitions for various items that we're talking about will somehow open up somebody's permit to more usage than was granted at the time of their use permit. I guess I'm looking for a CEQA response to that.
So through the chair, I think just to be crystal clear, this ordinance does not apply to existing use permits. So that should be understood. If anyone who has an existing use permit, you know, is unclear on what is allowed under their use permit, then that is a kind of a case-by-case analysis that they kind of need to engage in with staff to determine if they needed to come in to modify their use permit. And if they did come in to modify their use permit, then we would apply you know, the current laws and regulations to them.
Okay, so just to be clear though, I mean, I asked this question before public comment, which was exactly what you were just mentioning. And I thought I heard that the definitions did apply to existing permits.
No. So the comment that I was making earlier is, you know, a definition is a definition, and if there's a condition of approval that specifically says they cannot have a commercial kitchen, then, you know, a change in the definition of commercial kitchen wouldn't alter that. It is what it is. You know, this is an update that is mostly, you know, clarifying of what is allowed and providing definitions. It's different than something like the cannabis ordinance update that was a sweeping change. So there are going to be a lot more things that are a little more borderline and, you know, may warrant discussion with staff on what is okay and what isn't okay based on old conditions of approval and old project descriptions. That being said, staff will always work with any use permit owners or even people who have an old zoning permit to see what we can do to come in line and harmonize between what was allowed and what is allowed now. But there is no wide sweeping change like we've seen in many other ordinance updates.
So
oh, sorry, go ahead.
To ask a quick question. Thanks, Mr. Carr. So for like the woman who operates a very small winery with their daughter's a winemaker, her use permit wouldn't be affected by by this document, essentially. Is that correct?
So Brian?
Through the chair, as long as, so any existing permit that Permit Sonoma has processed and approved, any of the conditions that are existing would not be affected. So I mean, I'm just kind of, I would double down on Council Klein's response.
You know, I think I'll just, because I got the history on this, and I, as Commissioner Tamura mentioned earlier, I have made comments in the past about confusion around what an event is over the course of the last 25 years. And the way to best explain it to me is, if you hold a use permit in 1990s and your use permit says nothing about events or commercial kitchens or anything like that, but over the course of time you began to have events and have commercial kitchen, et cetera, et cetera. And you might have done that based upon the fact that you just wanted to do it because you thought it was good for your business and you wanted to do it, and you didn't really care whether or not it was consistent with the county permit because it was all, nothing was mentioned either adverse or pro. Or you may be someone who went and talked to his supervisor or his planning commissioner in the middle of the thing and got told by somebody that thought events were okay. Or it may be that a committee was formed, which I was part of back in the late 90s, about whether or not events were part of ag promotion, et cetera, et cetera. There may be many circumstances where winery owners feel like they have a grandfathered right to do an event even if their permit didn't say they did. And that is what's causing these comments from people that are saying, you're taking away my grandfathered rights, because in effect, they don't have grandfathered rights in some cases. In other cases, they may have grandfathered rights for some reason or another. So that is what's raising this. The council's answer is absolutely correct. You don't get affected if you have a grandfathered right. But you may think you have a grandfathered right and you don't. And that's what Scott's talking about. He will work with the operators to determine what grandfathered rights that operator has. And that's subject to appeal, can be brought to the commission and the board on appeal, can be taken to the courts or whatever. But that's where I think that a lot of the concerns are being raised around grandfathered rights. And you know, that's a legal deal. I worked for 10 years on gravel mining vested rights and went through a extended process with different operators about what they thought they could do and what they could do, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's best to put that aside in terms of this debate, because it's just not going to get anywhere, and everybody's that's answered it so far has been absolutely correct. This ordinance is not going to affect anyone's grandfathered rights. The question is whether you have grandfathered rights as a old winery permit, and that we can't answer that, and nobody can answer that without a lot of research. So, you know, that's why I wanted to have this conversation. I mentioned it earlier, is because set it aside, because it's not an issue for us to deal with today.
So is that thank you, Commissioner Carr. I appreciate that clarification. I just want to confirm that with Deputy Director Orr and Council that is consistent with what they were saying.
Consistent with what I was saying, yes.
Me too.
Okay, well, thank you, Commissioner Carr. I thought that was much clearer than what I heard before. I mean, I think that is, and when you say, well, let's set it aside, I mean, I feel like if I were a person with a winery who had been operating under some permit that was unclear in the past, I'd be a little bit nervous about this. And I think that, you know, effectively, you know, whether you call it a grandfathered right or not, you're saying, well, we don't really know, but let's set it aside. And I feel like, well, I mean, no, that's a real issue. You know, whether you're the winery owner or whether you're one of the affected residents nearby.
Yeah, which is why I wanted to ask that.
It's not only difficult for that reason, it's difficult a lot of times to do the research it takes to really figure out the answer.
Yeah, and I just wanted to verify, because I know like a lot of our permits over the years, because this industry is so established here and our permitting process has changed so much, that we have a wide variety of, you know, silent permits versus semi-silent permits versus kind of what we're trying to do now. So I just wanted to make sure that we could cover that, so people who were listening had a guideline to work off of.
Well, you know, maybe the board would consider formalizing a process that would offer, you know, the staff research into a number of permits if in fact folks wanted to do that, you know, to get it settled. But I do remember we've had new permits come in over the years where it's an older winery that wants to change, and a couple of wineries, I remember Kenwood, for example, wanted to clarify their event permission because it wasn't clear in their old permit. They ended up withdrawing for different reasons, but that does happen, and you know, and I think actually a good winery owner that's worried should come forward and fix it.
So I have a question. I know I think it was Vicky, I can't remember her last name, of the Dry Creek group, mentioned what the supervisors had stated in their resolution from October of 2018, or maybe it was 2016. Do we have that language, that specific language? Because I wanted to make sure I understood exactly what the board directed.
Through the chair, I don't believe we have it included in the report. I mean, absolutely, unless staff corrects me. But you know, that's something we could.
Well, I mean, the part that I saw that is in the report, I did an electronic search when that comment came up, and in the draft resolution that is before us, there's a couple of whereases in the 5th and 6th paragraphs that talk about the October 11th, 2016 Board of Supervisors adopted resolution and the October 16th, 2018 resolution. But they simply say, you know, adopted something directing staff to initiate zoning code, and they seemed less specific than what the commenter mentioned. And so I just wanted to understand what was there. I mean, I guess I do have the question. I know, and so I started as a commissioner in 2016, and this has been around since before I started. And, you know, certainly at some presentations we heard in several years ago, there was a thought that different sectors of the county were different. And that's why they had these community groups and CACs, and that some were successful in hammering out something and some weren't, and that there were going to be, you know, differences for those different areas. And so, you know, maybe I missed the specific direction from the board saying, no, we got to make these all the same now.
I would, through the chair, I would say that, you know, the policy and the draft standards before you are mindful of the board direction for us to distinguish between, or at least recognize that there are areas of concentration throughout the county that need a bit of a closer look. What you have before you today is a blanket standard, sort of a baseline, if you will, across the board for the county. And, you know, similar to what we did with Dry Creek, CAC, most recently with Sonoma Valley CAC, that was very much a community-driven process, you know, born locally through the advisory committee. And so, you know, at this point, the staff direction, you know, in our interpretation with that direction from the Board of Supervisors was to create a baseline standard for what works, with the recognition that there are some additional guidelines that should be considered in the 3 areas of concentration that were recognized back then.
So it sounds like you're referring to a specific direction. Could I see that specific direction that you're referring to?
I would be able,
Through the chair, we'll work on getting it to admin and post it on the agenda.
Okay, I'll let it get the other commissioners get their comments in. Commissioner Davis, yeah.
I have just one question, and then I've got some comments that I think when we get into that section I can make. But how many? So I actually addressing something the last speaker said, sort of sideways here. How many new winery applications have we processed in the last 10 years, say? You know, some kind of I mean, or how many are we doing a year? Do we have a ballpark?
I believe that's in
that?
our staff report, Commissioner Davis.
I'm asking the question.
Yeah.
Through the chair, I do have an extra slide prepared with the chart from the board study session. report and also some numbers with the last few event permits that have been approved. If you'd like to share that.
It wasn't so much the events necessarily as the wineries, because I mean, I'm hearing, we have some old established wineries, but I know, I can't tell you how many winery applications with or without events that I've heard in the last 12 years, but it's been more than a handful by a long shot. And, one of the other commenters made some comment. It's like, we have this increase in competition between wineries, and I'm just curious, how many more wineries do we have in the last dozen years, say, or 5, or do we have an idea about how many we're approving each year?
Yes, so from the time period of between 2016 and 2021, Permit Sonoma BZA has approved a total of 17 winery and tasting room projects. One of those permits was for ag processing only. The other 16 included, some sort of visitor serving use, such as events and tasting. And then we have data on the years from 2005 to 2015. 162 winery and tasting room projects were approved. So that does not include the ag processing only data, but we do have that. I just, don't have it memorized at this time.
Got it. Okay. And so those last 17 or whatever the first number was since 2016, that was through fires and floods and COVID and all that, but another 162 on top of that going back. So, okay, that's helpful to me. And I'm going to hold my comments till we start some discussion. Thank you.
I think discussion is kind of starting, but I'll let other commissioners weigh in who haven't spoken yet. Commissioner Diaz?
I was going to let Ms. Ocaña go first. She raised her.
Thank you, Commissioner Diaz. I hope I'm not repeating myself, but one of the things that I am recognizing from a lot of the concerned residents is this thought that the ordinance is going to automatically increase the ability for existing wineries to have more events, or to have larger events, or to have some kind of larger impact on the neighboring roadways, waterways, and neighborhoods. So I understand where we're going with we haven't quite kind of clarified the grandfathering in, and I do understand that this ordinance is not supposed to apply to former permits. But I think it's one of the things I'm really hearing a lot from these kind of neighborhood groups is this, like Mr. Bommersbach mentioned, was this idea of entitlements, that a lot of the established wineries are going to look at this ordinance as an entitlement to increase their impact without having to go through additional CEQA monitoring or revisions. So I'm wondering if staff could speak to that. I'm not quite sure there is a way to satisfy the concerns, but I'm wondering if that's just a misunderstanding of what's happening. So I feel like a lot of people think that with this ordinance, the established wineries are going to be able to do more than what their permits are already allowing them to do.
Through the chair, so it is a misunderstanding. So any existing winery that would like to come in to apply to expand their tasting hours, the number of people served in the tasting room, their events, would be subject to the discretionary use permitting process, which includes environmental review as regulated by CEQA. And so we'll be analyzing that project request on its own specific site and neighborhood constraints. And often those projects require a substantial amount of information for us to complete our CEQA analysis. So we're talking about traffic studies, noise studies, water studies, sometimes biological assessments of the property. So any use permit requests to come in asking to expand their operations because the new winery standards, if adopted, may allow potentially more uses on their site, would still have to go through the same discretionary process that they went through before to obtain their use permit.
And so then if I could just ask a kind of follow-up question to that. If an established winery was granted, say, 10 events a year, and in there, would you, I hope this isn't asking too much, but would you give us an example of like an established winery, you know, kind of on the average scale that would have events that could potentially be modified by this ordinance? So I understand that there's the visitor servicing activities and there's the winery events. An established winery with their events on the books, you know, and granted through the county, how is this chart going to affect them? Can their activities, what was like if they had one winery event and now they can kind of change the definition of that, so now they get to do more because it's visitor servicing activities? I hope that I'm being clear here. I'm just trying to honor the concerns of people who think that who seem to believe that these impacts could automatically increase with this ordinance.
Well, I would say to that, in order to provide you a thorough response to that question, we would have to analyze our winery database that contains all this data for the number of events approved per winery. You know, as you know, we have over 450 wineries approved in the county. So it would take us a little bit of time to complete that research. There has some of this research has been done during the 2016 board study sessions. And so we do have information from a staff report that was prepared for the board at that time. It's just that the numbers are a bit outdated, but we certainly can get you some of that information after this meeting.
I know.
To the chair, I would also comment that if anyone who is listening, operates a winery and wonders, what does this mean for me yesterday, and what does it mean for me a year from now? I mean, that's the type of thing that, that's the reason the planning department exists, is so that we can help not only industry folks but members of the public understand, sometimes overly complex language and really get to the point of how it applies to the individual. So, I assume that we're going to have some kind of recommendation from the Planning Commission to the board, and between the Planning Commission and the board would be a great time to, if you've got a use permit, contact your planner. If you don't have a use permit, contact just the planning department in general, and we'll assign someone to talk about what you're allowed to do under your use permit and what the recommendation to the board could mean for you, and use that when framing your public comment to the Board of Supervisors. I think that's the most sensible way to really understand and get around any misunderstandings, is taking that extra time. And I know that a meeting like this doesn't really lend itself to that kind of personal touch and getting down to what does condition 23 out of 100 mean for this use permit from 2017. So I just want to offer that forward to anyone listening.
And no, it is absolutely clear that no one with a use permit is going to have their use permit changed by this ordinance. That can't happen. They have to come in and apply to make whatever new regulations apply. They do not get it automatically.
And likewise, there's also due process if there was ever to be a discussion about revocation. It's all the same procedural rights. Just like if a neighbor was to complain about noise, it goes through the code enforcement process. It doesn't instantly result in the nullification of the use permit. So just to be very clear that nothing will be null and voided, nothing will be taken away.
we ready to go?
I'm ready. You
So,
probably knew that.
well, I'll just kick off and say that it was it was a little challenging reading this. I have been really frustrated in the past few years dealing with wineries and events. I see Greg's smile there. And you know, I think that I've kind of dug my heels in along the way, and I'm feeling like digging my heels in today. I appreciate that there's been a change in marketing needs for wineries, and that with the need to direct consumer sales. I totally appreciate that. I disagree with Mike Martini. I mean, I do agree. I do agree that agriculture is a commercial enterprise, but I don't think that you know, having parties and special events is appropriate on ag lands, and I feel like I've been pretty clear about that. You know, I appreciate the ag community's really strong support for open space and ag lands, and I also, you know, and I've said this a few times, just quipping that, you know, if we're going to have event setters and party places in ag lands, then we should, you know, they should apply to have the zoning change to K, which is visitor serving uses. And I know that, you know, and I realize the ridiculousness of that, because that's not something that ag community would support. And, you know, but similarly, I don't particularly support having events on agricultural land. And I think the public pays the price for that. I think that the public pays the cost of the impacts, whether it's traffic, water use, sound, you know, loss of access to other uses. You know, I mean, we have a lot of bicycle conflicts, and why should wineries have the access to, you know, using the public infrastructure to support their businesses, but we can't safely ride our bikes? You know, the increase in tourism, you know, it's, you know, Mr. Martini made a comment about, you know, bringing people to Sonoma County, or maybe it was somebody else, I don't know. And by the way, Mike, I totally appreciate you, and I have a huge amount of respect for your, you know, for your interest and passion. But, you know, increase in tourism affects our infrastructure. And somebody made a comment about, you know, Instagram, and, you know, we've seen just social media is just driving, you know, huge impacts in the county. And our community subsidizes the marketing impacts, you know. So all that to say, you know, I've got quite a few comments, but I'll kind of get down to it. I mean, I would really like to see, I agree. I think that tasting rooms are perfectly appropriate for wineries. I think doing food and wine pairing are perfectly appropriate. You know, doing tours, fine. But I think when we get into looking at pickup parties, release parties, club parties, winemaker dinners, industry-wide events, you know, even seminars, I feel like we need to, the public needs to have the ability to evaluate those. And I don't think that, you know, just because you have a winery that gets approved, that you should automatically be, you know, entitled to having parties on ag land. You know, there's a few other comments in here around, you know, roads. I would really like to see, you know, if we're going to have party centers on ag land, I think it should be on a main artery or near a main artery. You know, having rural roads impacted. You know, I don't think that's realistic. I mean, Kendall Jackson is perfectly located. They're right off the freeway, you know. Coppola, which is zoned K, by the way, you know, is right off the highway. But, you know, heading out some of the, you know, more rural roads are an issue. Sorry, I'm just gonna like lay it out here. You know, I think as far as environmental review, you know, I think there's and I know I've certainly experienced this. I've heard other planning commissioners question some of this stuff. The public has certainly questioned some of the studies we get, whether it's a traffic study or a water study. You know, there's questions about that, and a lack of confidence in some of that, and you know, I'm concerned about that. the idea of having, I mean, I think whether it's a minimum parcel size or some other way to assure we're not having standalone tasting rooms, and this is a little bit outside the purview of the ordinance here, but having tasting rooms, having wineries on parcels that can that have the ability to support their processing capacity. We have a lot of wineries, and I think in the winery database, I didn't look at it real closely this time, but I know in the past we've seen how much capacity some of these wineries are permitted for, and they're doing half of that, or they're doing a third of that, or and so there's a ton of capacity out there already. But yet we've approved, almost 200 wineries since, I don't remember what the date was on that, sorry, 2012 or whatever it is, 180, 190 wineries with even additional capacity. So, there's some details in here. I don't need to get into the whole thing, but I am of a mind to snug this up. I think the definitions are absolutely important, but I'm going to tend to lean on the more conservative side on that. So I think that's enough. Thank you. I'm glad I wasn't muted.
No, you find out later on you're muted, right?
Okay. Any other commissioners want to?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Commissioner Carr.
So, I think a lot of these standards that are proposed here are pretty consistent with what the commission has been, generally speaking, approving. I do think like the food service and the access and different things like that. I think the big issue for me has always been the events. And I think the events are what, at least down my neck of the woods, are what are getting people upset, especially when they all seem to run together at certain times of the year and create problems. But here's what I took from that workshop we had with a couple hundred people. What the most consistent thing that people said was, it's the scale of the event. It's the size of the event. And so if you're telling me that you're going to have an ag promotional activity of whatever you want to do during the daytime, and you're going to tell that to B.R. Cohn Winery in Sonoma Valley, and he's going to have a concert for 600 people a day, and that's not going to be even counted as an event, that's crazy. I'm sorry, that just doesn't work. And I on the other hand, I completely agree with Mike Martini that the commission routinely approves private events that I would argue are not promotional. He called it tangentially promotional, and I agree with that. I don't think the public really cares whether an event is an ag promotional event or whether it's a wedding or a concert or that. I think what they're worried about is when they're big. And that's what's lacking in these definitions. There's nothing in here about the scale or the size of an event. How do you distinguish between an event and a party? If you say, if I'm a winery operator and you took away my events, I come in and say, all right, I'm going to have a party, and it's going to be 300 people, and we're all going to drink wine and drive out onto the roadway. So that's the clarity there is missing, and that's why I think what I think Sonoma Valley did is a good approach. And they said if you're doing an event over 30 people, that's an event, and it doesn't matter whether it's a wine club, whether it's a release party, whether it's a concert, it doesn't matter, because when you start getting into the larger events, that's when people are in the neighborhood get upset and where they have complaints. And by the way, those complaints don't come in because they're useless, because they happen on weekends and nobody at the county can come out and enforce them. People down our way don't even bother complaining anymore because there's no way to get anywhere with the complaint. But anyway, so I guess that's what I'm looking for, is something that that defines what can be done as part of those activities. I completely agree with the industry with the tours and the rides and all that kind of stuff is part of the business model. They should be able to do that every day that they're operating within the standards that are operating. But as soon as you schedule something, as soon as you have a specific time and date where there is a an event, that's when the event thing is triggered. And I think that's important, because that's where you have 50 people or 100, that's where the management of that event becomes important. It's where you need the coordinator, you need the traffic management plan, you need the shuttling and all that kind of stuff. So that's what's missing here. The language is way too vague as to what a party is and what an event is. And I think if we could straighten that out, I think we could go pretty far with this. The other things that I'm kind of looking at, I think a couple years ago the industry came up with a best practices sheet that I thought was really good. It was for industry-wide events, and it was a series of techniques that the industry could use to try to minimize the impact on the neighborhoods. And I can't find it in my files, but I'll bet you I would really like to see that adopted as part of either guidelines or code for the industry-wide events, because I think by and large commissioners and neighbors are okay with industry-wide events because they know they're happening, they know they're going to be, they can leave for the weekend or whatever, but they know they're going to happen. They're not going to be ad hoc and coming in when the neighbors don't when they least expect it. I think wine trade meetings should be stopped at 5 o'clock. They're the same thing as regular business activities. There's no reason why you should be having a wine trade party after 5. And I think some of the other standards that are recommended by the different neighborhood groups we ought to consider. One I think is important is no permanent structures to be used for events. You put the events outside, or you put them in your existing winery and other buildings, processing buildings, but no separate space. I think you make shuttling on an as-needed basis, not as requested. I think that's one of the things in the ordinance that I thought was important to change. I do not agree with the outdoor amplification restriction. I think that is often applied in the permits, but I think that should be case by case. I think there are many cases where it's so minimal that it doesn't need the 1,600-foot thing, but I think that's a permit issue. Minimum parcel size, Sonoma Valley really wants it. I do not think it should be a county-wide standard. I do think it's important in some of these areas. West Side, I know it is, but a 20-acre parcel size in Sonoma Valley in the concentrated areas would mean nothing. There aren't parcels in that size range, and if there are, they're so few it doesn't really matter. And the other thing I think about a 20-acre minimum is the small grower that wants to get into the business that needs a little bit of event, needs a little bit of direct-to-consumer to get going. That getting a 20-acre parcel just makes it a little bit harder for them to make that happen financially. So I'm willing to let the use permit decide on the size of the parcel county-wide. I am going to lobby for 20-acre minimum in Sonoma Valley because that's what the committee wants. The other 18-foot roadway, I think that's a county-wide standard. There's no reason to have a winery on a road that's narrower than 18 feet, and it's just going to get us in trouble. And I'm going to add the other fire safety thing. I think it's important. A red flag warning closes any event. If there's a red flag warning, your event is gone. I'm sorry, I know you already ordered all your stuff and everything, but it's just that the evacuation issue is just too critical these days. I do think the separation standard that was mentioned, I think that's very important in the 3 concentrated areas. I do not think that should be a county-wide standard because I just don't see the justification. The other standards, I think there are a lot of other standards that we recommended in Sonoma Valley, and that's a discussion for another day. But I do think that if we do these things, this would certainly be I think a good ordinance. It would be a good set of standards, and would not, contrary to some opinion, would not stifle the wine industry. I think they would be able to continue to operate, but with a little more sensitivity toward neighborhood groups. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Diaz.
I think my biggest concern with this ordinance as it stands is that the function it's trying to fulfill is clarity. It's trying to make explicit things that we need to make sure that everybody is playing with the same set of rules and that we're all speaking the same language and using the same nomenclature. And then listening to commissioners and industry leaders and neighborhood people, it doesn't sound like we've achieved clarity. Everybody seems a little confused, where everybody's saying the same thing, which is this isn't quite clear enough for us. For the industry in general, I know in my neck of the woods, we have a lot of these areas of concentration. I think that we should be really careful about how much regulation that we are hitting everybody with. Because I really don't want to do is create a scenario in which we've gotten so regulatory that the only people who can pay to play are Kendall Jackson and Constellation Brands. Like, I really want to make sure that what we do is we protect small producers and allow them to get into the game or make a living. So I like what Mr. Carr said, which was, minimum parcel size could be handled at the use permit level, because a 20-acre parcel in Dry Creek Valley is going to be prohibitively expensive for almost anybody trying to start a winery. In terms of, I don't mind pickup parties. I think if pickup parties are happening during normal operation hours and your site can handle what is happening, I don't mind pickup parties. I don't know that they add. I've been in the valleys when there are pickup parties happening. It doesn't feel much more congested than any other time. I think sometimes we saddle wineries with the congestion in the valley. Like, I know that the worst congestion I've ever seen in the valley is when all of a sudden there's like a bike race. I love cycling. Those roads are chancy on how well they've done it. I know those have always been more disruptive to people I know and to me in the area, more so than, even Passport Weekend, which locals know to stay away from. Winemaker dinners, as long as they fall into your events permit use, I'm really okay with those. I understand. I think weddings, concerts, stuff like that, I think that's a separate, you have to apply for a special permit, especially if it's going to go over your allotted, the capacity of your property, or it's going to go late. Like, I think those are special events. I think those should be handled with a specific permit. But I think we have to strike the appropriate balance. And I think my biggest issue right now is that it doesn't feel like our ordinance has achieved clarity, and that is it's the one thing we're really shooting for.
Thank you, Commissioner Diaz. Yeah, I guess, I'm glad the 1st, 4th, and 5th districts have said a lot since they have the most wineries. Actually, it occurred to me too, I neglected to divulge something else earlier on. So many years ago, I was married at a winery in Sonoma County. There were 24 people there. And I'm also the member of a wine club for a Dry Creek winery. So I felt like I should divulge that in case it has any bearing on anything. But aside from that, I think, just from what I've seen is, as Commissioner Diaz was pointing out, it's like if this is supposed to achieve clarity, it seems like the mission's not accomplished. I think, I guess what I'm concerned about is, if the supervisors gave specific direction that we needed to have uniform definitions across the county, that was what I think Vicki Farrow mentioned, then I think that's something that we should know. And if they didn't say that, then that's something we should be aware of too. I mean, I feel like, and I appreciate the comments that Commissioner Carr and Davis and Diaz all mentioned. I think they've all been brought up before over the last 25 years. As my understanding, certainly they've been brought up over the last 5 years that I've been here. But, everybody's got a slightly different opinion on things. And, I'm just not sure we're saddling staff with an impossible task here. So, my first gut reaction is, okay, this isn't accomplishing its goal. And, to say, yeah, I wouldn't recommend approval of this. But given the nature of this issue, anything we come up with, I'm feeling like it's going to come across some of the same problems. So I'm not really sure how to keep staff from going in the same do loop they've been in for the last 25 years.
Well, the
And
way,
maybe-
the way we, through the chair, the way we would do that is give some explicit instruction, I think. And I don't know whether it's something that can be, that we can craft today, or whether it's something we ask to come back, you know, with some specific language. I would like to see, if I was going to try to craft something personally, or you know, work with the commissioners on a standard by standard basis, we could go through the ordinance and talk about some of the various changes that we want to make. That's what we usually do. I just feel like that might take a while, and I'm concerned about Commissioner Ocaña having to duck out, and I'm also concerned about Commissioner Davis not being here for a comeback. But I think we could, you know, I'd be willing to take a shot at offering some of what I said earlier, but I don't know that there's any support for any of that. So
I'm amenable to that. I know this is a big issue that we've been, you know, everybody's been trying to tackle for a while, but we've been trying to tackle for a while. There's no reason to shove it through if we're not content with it.
okay, well, we can, I mean, we can also take straw votes on some of the individual things if there's something, you know, that you feel. I guess I would, number one, I would request a definition of a party, or at least a cap on what the size of a party might be. A few years ago, the Board of Supervisors had a bunch of complaints from residences about parties in the neighborhoods, not at wineries. And they ended up deciding on just a sort of off-the-cuff policy basis that anything over 35 people was not a party. You know, that if you're going to have a party in your home, 35 people was the most people that you should be able to accommodate, and still call it a party without it being like something else, a hotel or you know, an event or whatever. They never did define an event. And I know the danger in asking staff to define an event as well is because it has county-wide implications. But if you're going to limit the definition of an event to a winery event, then I think similarly it should be include a number of people. So like in Sonoma Valley, we said 30. I'm not locked into 30, but I think somewhere between 30 and 40 is probably a good. I think so. A party would be, to me, would be less than that, and an event would be more than that. And the other thing about an event that I think is critical is that it is at a scheduled time and place. That's what makes it different than a tasting room or an industry-wide where people are coming in and out all day. So you never get all those people in place at the same time. So I guess I'm saying, let's have if you're going to have a party, that's going to be a scheduled event at a time and place at the winery, and an event is going to be a scheduled time and place, and one is less than 35 and one is more. And that means that anytime you're over that number of people, whether it's day or night, weekend or weekday, you're in an event, and we're going to count that as an event, and it's going to be managed like an event, and it's going to be subject to the event standards. That, to me, that's the only way you get clarity here.
Through the chair, just from an enforcement perspective, are you saying that if it's, you know, middle of the day on a weekday and just through some stroke of fate, 50 people arrive unrelated to each other at the same time, that should be treated as an event? Just so that I'm clear on.
No. That's why the scheduled time and place, that's what's critical. If you're running a winery and you got your tasting rooms open and a busload of San Franciscans comes up and wants to taste wine, that's fine. And your tasting room may have flexible numbers of people. That's just the way they are. You know, they can't predict. But if you say we're having a wine club party at 4 o'clock at X winery, and that's when you can come, and we're going to have, you know, a big party for all the wine club members, that's an event, because you're pre-scheduling it and bringing everybody there at the same time on purpose. And the other factor is because those types of parties are the worst for impacts on driver safety. Those weddings are the same kind of thing. Where people are drinking a lot, they're having a good time for a short period of time. Even with food, there's more, I'd say there are bigger safety issues with those kinds of things. So I'm just saying those need to be managed. But a regular tasting room operation that has tours, you can taste, you can tour the vineyard, you can do all that kind of stuff. You can educate people, take them into the back room and show them how to make wine. That's just part of the activity. That's not an event. The only time it becomes an event or a party is when it's pre-scheduled.
Commissioner Carr,
So
may I
just
ask a
that-
clarifying question? Oh.
Sure.
Go for it.
In terms of normal business hours versus, say, after
Evening.
5 o'clock, how do you feel about the distinction? If there's a over 30 or under 30, I'm just curious on if it's scheduled time and place, but if they're sort of by right during normal business hours versus extended 9, 10 o'clock type of thing.
I kind of like the way the standards are at the 5 o'clock closure for regular tasting room businesses, and I like the idea of having, I think having evening events is fine. The only objection I had was the wine trade meetings going after 5. I thought that was a little bit outside of what I would call a day-to-day activity. And since those are by invitation, and I'm guessing there typically would not be more than 30, 35 people in those meetings, they can have those in any day of the week, and as long as it doesn't get over that level that is specified, then they're not an event.
So for the sake of possibly getting to something that could end up in a resolution or direction to staff. So in the definition of wine trade activities, which is wine trade activities are by invitation meetings, seminars, harvest parties, and similar activities attended only by wine trade partners and are not advertised to the consumer. Would you feel comfortable if a numerical limit was added to that definition?
Well, wine. You mean like if it's 35 people or more, it's one thing, and if it's 35 people or less, it's another.
Right.
I'm saying it doesn't matter who. I'm saying it doesn't matter who the attendee is. If it's
right. So as currently written, that's the only activity that's allowed between 5 o'clock and 10 o'clock. Exactly. So, trying to get to a point of an actionable item, would modifying that definition meet kind of the intent of your direction?
I think just to put a finer point on it, Commissioner Carr, for purposes of putting something before us in an ordinance, we need to have like some specific language suggestions as opposed to concept. I think conceptually, people understand what you're saying, but I think what he's asking for is, okay, what would we put in there? So
I'm saying what you would put in here right at the beginning of the definitions is a definition of a party and a definition of an event or a winery event, with changing the definition of winery event to make it a size figure in there. And that.
Can I ask a question, Greg, on that? So you've mentioned party and you've mentioned event. To me, the way you're describing them, an event and a party are the same thing. And an activity would be something like the wine tasting and the tours and the seminars, the activities. But the way I'm hearing, and I just want to make sure we're not talking about 3 things now, because right now we have visitor serving activities, which as currently listed is wine tasting, pickup parties, and then wine trade partner things. But then there's also the winery events, which to me, when I'm hearing you talk about that, I'm thinking you're talking and party at the same time. I'm thinking it sounds like the same thing. I just want to be clear what you're saying.
I guess I'm putting the activities and the parties all part of that 10 to 5 operation of the tasting room. And what I'm saying is, even if it's an activity,
okay,
if it's over 35 people, it's an event.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah,
I understand.
Because I think that's, basically that's what the neighbors are seeing. They're seeing all these people come at the same time. I think they're used to the idea over the course of the years where people are coming in and out of a tasting room all day long. It's a different deal. Yeah, I wasn't trying to create a third thing. This thing about activities is it kind of
It's
confusing,
clear.
but I think if you look at it as 35 or more, or 30 or 40, whatever, or less, that drives it. Everything else is just part of the business.
So Greg, oh, sorry, go for it, Mr. Kenya. I'll follow you.
I just wanted to jump in for maybe to add on some of that clarity. I wonder if there's a possibility, instead of arbitrarily picking a number like 30 or 35, that we could work off of capacity. And I don't know if each winery already has a capacity number on the books with the county. If they did, that would be great, because then we could say, you know, anything above 30% of your capacity is considered an event. One of the concerns that I have, though, is something as simple as booking a popular musician on like a Saturday. So a lot of wineries book local talent, and if that local talent has a following, then they're going to end up at the winery. And in my view, I don't think that it would be fair for a winery to use up one of their allowable events if, per se, they booked a regular musician who ended up bringing a whole bunch of people, and then they, you know, and then that caused neighbor complaints and whatnot. So I would just like to be conscientious about, you know, the consequences of establishing a number on those parties. Although I absolutely agree with Commissioner Carr that we should have a broader definition of what a party is, especially under, I think, the wine trade, you know, umbrella, because that's really what it seems like most people are concerned about, is the visitor serving activities that they can do on a regular basis. And we've got parties under the wine trade umbrella.
I guess that would fall under like what Greg's condition, that like it had to be planned by the winery at a prescribed time. So I guess like if you invited a musician to come play at your tasting room and he invited a bunch of people, that's not on the winery to manage. That's in the nature of the musician's job. That's kind of the take I would.
Right, but that's difficult because the winery planned the event and they sent out social media posts and they sent out flyers, and it's an event that they planned. And you know, so obviously, if it's raining and that popular musician shows up, then we're not going to have a problem. But I worry about worst case scenario where people start filing complaints if a winery catches like a, you know.
Fair.
Davis.
What if they are going to have more than 35 people, and that is the definition of an event, that it must also be limited ticket sales, for example, you know, that they put a cap on it so that you don't have this popular musician coming in with 40 of his closest friends, because it's an invite only thing if you're going to have more than 35 people.
Well, my argument to that, playing the devil's advocate, is you also have to understand that local musicians' friends are not going to buy cases of wine. So then you end up with the problem where you have all of these people and the winery's not making the money, and now they're in this conflicted situation where they're having an event and they're going against their permit usage. So I don't have the answer. It's just something to think about. I really like the idea of having a number, but I am concerned about picking an arbitrary number. I think it should have to do with capacity on the site.
That's always the difficult part.
Yeah, I guess, you know, what I'm hearing here, I feel like it is a bit of Groundhog Day here. You know, I feel like, you know, yes, I mean, everybody's got good points and comments, and there's all these different scenarios that can apply. I'm not real optimistic about us hammering out some language by the end of the day here. You know, just based on what I'm hearing. I mean, this is just one piece of it we're talking about, and we can't really agree. So, or come up with specific suggestions for staff. I guess I still wanted to return my earlier question, which I still haven't heard the answer to, which is, did we get direction from the Board of Supervisors to come up with uniform definitions for the entire county that couldn't be different for different areas? Because I mean, I know at one point in time, few years ago, it was kind of the opposite. They said, well, we can't treat all areas of the county the same. We've got to look at these things differently. And the fact that there were some CACs that had some success was something that was kind of pointed to as, oh, great, you know, that there's some success there. But is the board now going in a different direction? Is that what I'm hearing?
Through the chair, I don't believe that there's any direction that's changed. I think what I'm hearing that might be helpful is a compare and contrast, and maybe just a little bit of background in how we established the countywide. And just to be clear, there is one definition for across the county that we're proposing here. But we also, as staff, did the research, you know, took the public comment into consideration and looked at, you know, what was being offered by each of the existing local guidelines, and, you know, took those variations and came up with sort of the best hybrid that we thought was appropriate to be applied countywide.
So
just briefly to expand on Brian's comment, I do want to stress that you know, staff only has control of staff. We can't tell the citizens advisory commissions or committees what their guidelines or definitions shall be. So if Dry Creek and Sonoma Valley want a different definition, I think the best thing staff can do is find a way to harmonize between those.
Well, I guess I'm going to ask my question one more time. So I understand what you did. What did the Board of Supervisors say with respect to whether things needed to be uniform countywide versus not?
Why don't I read to you the key paragraph from the resolution?
Thank you.
I don't know if it. Now therefore be it resolved that the Board of Supervisors hereby directs staff to prepare a draft ordinance amending the county zoning code for consideration by the Planning Commission and recommendation to the Board of Supervisors to clarify the definition of events and food service, require cultural event permits for industry-wide events, and allow tasting rooms and events in industrial park zones where facilities already provide processing. The Board of Supervisors further directs staff to develop standards and citing criteria for events in areas of local concentration for adoption, either as part of the zoning code or as separate guidelines. So I'll pause there. And what has been done is that through the CACs, they've draft sort of separate guidelines is what was prepared by these individual groups. Those are not binding, you know, adopted county code. The board left it open as to, you know, whether these things would be adopted as part of the code. And if they are adopted as part of the code, they apply countywide. One option, it doesn't sound like that's really what's developed, kind of grassroots, but is to just define local concentration in a way that hits the areas that have already come up with these different guidelines. I think probably those of you who've been following this policy have seen it grow up in these areas in different ways. That's just how it developed. Yeah. So it is what it is. It's what staff has to work with, but certainly it's within your purview if you would like to, you know, direct staff or provide comments to the board on sort of how you think that those should operate, because it's the countywide ordinance that's going to apply uniformly and be required. It's the individual guidelines that will not trump the ordinance.
Right, and that's my concern, I guess, right? And that was what one of the commenters mentioned too, is that, you know, gee, they did all this work and now it's going to get trumped by, you know, a code that, which I understand, you're trying to meld these things together, but by melding them together because they're different, you're necessarily changing them.
But look at, let me make a suggestion on that, because that's a critical point. The definitions are one thing, the standards are another. What makes sense in the end is to have one set of definitions for the entire county. That's what would make sense. That may be out of our purview at this point, but that's what would make sense. The definitions, standards can be different because standards can address the concentrated areas. The Dry Creek Valley is different than Sonoma Valley is different than West Side. And so that's where I feel comfortable telling my CAC people that when we go to the Board of Supervisors in August or something, we'll have a set of standards that we can lobby for. And maybe the board will agree, maybe they won't. But the important thing is, if you don't have a set of clear definitions, you can't do good standards. You just can't do it. That's an event. Is it a party? Is it a, this, that, and the other? And that's what, to me, the opportunity here in this countywide ordinance is to do definitions that could be applicable to the whole county. And I'm just, to Wendy, I'm just talking about wineries. I'm not talking about CAF, but to deal with that focus of it. And that's what I'm pitching for. I think the definitions in the Sonoma Valley CAC local guidelines is the kind of definition very close to, if not it, the definition for events that we should have in the county-wide ordinance. I don't, it may be too restrictive for some or too loose for some, I don't know, but there's a specific definition in terms of size for events, all three of the different types, private, ag promotional, and industry-wide. And I think if you have some definition around that, could be maybe a little more than 30, maybe less than 30, whatever the number of staff feels is appropriate. But I think if we came back with definitions like that we could vote on, or at least agree on, and then look at the standards, because then we'll know what we're talking about when we read the standards.
Yeah, that all makes sense to me, and because I'd heard different commenters talking about adding in citing criteria and stuff like this, and that goes beyond just the definitions. So yeah, if we want to focus on just definitions, I think that would be definitely, and that's what we used to always call this, actually, was right definition of winery events. So is that something? I'm just looking at exactly the draft that we have in front of us right now and what all is in there.
Well, I guess I'm, in light of your caution about the time, I think we're up against it. I would just suggest that staff go back and relook at all the definitions, but come back with a definition that is similar to or reflects what's in the Sonoma Valley local guidelines. And that has a threshold that triggers an event as soon as you get over a certain number of people. I'm appreciative of Commissioner Okanya's concern about that, because I do, a lot of wineries book musicians, but if you want to book a musician in your tasting room for a Saturday, afternoon thing, that's a business activity. That's to me, that's fine. But if you put a notice out there and you tell everybody we're going to have, Van Morrison's coming in at 10 this morning, I'm sorry, that's an event.
I agree with that. I agree with that. I'm on board.
The real question is, who wants to be the one to come up with the arbitrary number? I mean, but I think in the end the board's going to decide that if they buy this proposal. But I do think somewhere around 30, 35 is if you think about parties that you have at your house versus parties you go to at a winery, that's, you can sort of begin to kind of capture what that threshold might be. And I just think if we told the staff can go through all of the definitions that are in that section D of the ordinance and come back with revised definitions, and then we can go through the standards at the next meeting. That's my only way out.
Just for the sake of being overly clear, is the direction for staff to go back and use the Sonoma Valley definitions and bring it back?
And that's what I'm suggesting, and I'm suggesting that we give you a little bit of freedom to analyze those Sonoma Valley definitions, and if you think there are other options or whatever, but I think that that would be the general direction that I would propose.
Did the Dry Creek group not have definitions too?
Yeah, I don't know.
believe they do, which I would like to
Do
have
they?
included. I would like to have included in the staff.
Yeah, that's a good
Yeah,
idea.
if I see staff nodding, it would be helpful if.
So I guess, you know, my take was that, okay, you know, yeah, if they're the same, great. And if they're different, well, then what does staff do, right? I mean, I feel like staff is probably aware of both these documents and has probably looked at some of these things already. But I guess what I hear Commissioner Carr saying is that, like, let's take it one step at a time.
Yeah.
And do the definitions first. And I think that's a great idea. And before we talk about any standards associated with those definitions. And, you know, in my mind, it sounded to me from what council read is that there wasn't a specific declaration from the supervisor that the definitions had to be the same everywhere. Yes, I understand for all kinds of reasons we would like them to be the same.
Right.
But if for some reason there's a difference and it's an important difference and it's already hammered out locally and people in each of those places is okay with it, you know, why try to make them the same?
Yeah, well, that's always a fallback.
Okay.
And I do completely agree. I, you know, probably should have thought of it myself, but to bring in the Dry Creek definitions as well. Let's look at both of them. Maybe we can make them match. Sure.
Okay, so the proposal in front of us was to consider some amendments and approve a resolution that is in our packet. Do I hear a recommendation from one of the commissioners with regard to what's in front of us?
Yeah, I would recommend that we continue this item with instructions to staff to bring back a revised section of definitions and that we should do a time certain return if we can.
I'm amenable to that.
Through the chair, I'm not confident that we can meet a time certain deadline. Additionally, I think given the you know, the level of public awareness about this, I would, if we were to continue to time certain, it wouldn't necessitate additional notice. But I just want to be clear that regardless of the continue to a date certain or uncertain, I would want additional notice for this project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm happy with whatever you want to do, Scott. The only, you know, the sooner you can bring it back, the more we retain.
I'm more confident on bringing it back sooner if the limit of what is being asked for is 2 sets of definitions.
Okay, good.
And I think it is, unless there's some other CAC group that came up with definitions. Is it mainly those two?
West Side is still going through the stakeholder.
Right, so they didn't agree on anything, right?
Yeah, not yet.
Okay.
For the sake of facilitating that meeting, would the commission ask for a table with the Sonoma Valley definition, the most similar Dry Creek definition, and then staff's attempt to harmonize them both all on one page? Is that?
That sounds nice if it's not too much
great.
to ask.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think harmonizing, but I also think if you have in your putting those things together, if you have some good ideas, bring them forward. But I do think that we need to at least bring those 2 area definitions together if we can. Did we ever get a second, Mr. Chairman?
I believe Commissioner Diaz seconded.
Oh, did.
Is that
Thanks.
correct? Yes.
So we'll do a roll call vote for staff bringing back as expeditiously as possible the Sonoma Valley definitions, the Dry Creek definitions, and possibly an attempt to harmonize them for the sake of developing standards to recommend to the Board of Supervisors.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Okay, so we'll go into a roll call vote. Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Ocaña.
Aye.
Commissioner Diaz.
Aye.
Commissioner Davis,
Aye.
and Chair Tamura.
Aye.
And before we scatter, council, is there anything you'd like to say about ex parte communications or anything related to the vote we just had?
Bet she does.
Well, it's this is a legislative act, not an act on an individual permit. So the rules around ex parte communication are not as strict. However, with that said, if you learn anything between now and the next hearing, you should disclose that on the record. And if you do receive anything, you should send it to staff so that it can be provided to all commissioners.
Okay, thank you, Council. And I guess before we go here, Commissioner Davis, so this is your last meeting is what I understood, correct? And I would
It is, and I just will finish up by saying I really have appreciated working with everyone. Yeah, it's been a long 12 years, and I know you guys are going to get some new and old blood on the next round, and so I wish everyone well. Sorry I didn't get to complete this process with you, but it's been a joy of an experience 99% of the time.
Well, thank you for your 12 years.
Yeah.
What's that, Commissioner?
Enjoy that trip to Belize.
Yes, we would love to join you in Belize. That would be nice.
Yes, Belize and then Ecuador. Don't forget Ecuador. So anyway, well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And to all the public out there, it's been my honor to sit in this position. And there's some grief and there's some relief. So I'm sure maybe I'll be seeing you on the other side of the dais.
Have a good time on your vacation.
Take care. Thank you so much. Blessings to all of you. Bye-bye.
And this meeting's
Thank you,
adjourned.
everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, staff.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I know that was a lot.
Thank you.